There are wars in the records of the Departamento Munitorum that were never supposed to happen. Not in the sense of being unforeseen, because the Departamento Munitorum foresees most things eventually given sufficient time and sufficient ledger space, but in the sense that they were not supposed to be necessary. Wars that began because something that should have held did not hold, because someone who should have remained loyal did not remain loyal, because the machinery of the Imperium, which is vast and ancient and driven by momentum rather than wisdom, produced in one place and at one moment the specific combination of conditions that the machinery had been designed to prevent and had in this instance entirely failed to prevent. The Siege of Vraks was one of those wars. It lasted 17 standard Terran years, from 813 of the 41st millennium to 830. The administratum, which had calculated the campaign in advance with the confidence of an institution that has never been wrong about anything it considered important enough to calculate, had estimated 12 years and was wrong by 5. The Death Korps of Krieg, which bore the weight of those 17 years in the specific and total way that the Death Korps bears everything, lost 14 million soldiers before the citadel fell. 14 million men, from a culture that had been producing soldiers the way that other worlds produce grain, each one a human being shaped from birth toward the expectation of a death in service to the Emperor, each one a numbered entry in the regimental tallies that the quartermaster cadre maintained with the same meticulous care that the siege engineers applied to the trench lines. 14 million. The number requires a pause, not because it is larger than all the other large numbers that the history of the Imperium generates with grinding regularity, but because of what it represents in the specific context of Vraks. 14 million men did not die taking a world of great strategic importance from a powerful enemy. 14 million men died taking an armoury world back from a cardinal, a man of the church, a preacher, a pilgrim, a pastor who had spent the years of his life telling people about the Emperor's love and the Emperor's mercy and the Emperor's protection, and who had, somewhere in the long path between that pastoral beginning and the final discovery of what was left of him in the citadel's innermost chambers, become something that the Emperor's love could not reach, and the Emperor's mercy had no reason to extend to. The Siege of Vraks is a war about the cost of mistakes. The mistake of building a civilization that teaches its people that faith is salvation, and then failing to distinguish between faith and fanaticism. The mistake of treating human lives as quantities in an actuarial calculation rather than as the specific, irreplaceable mortal things they are. The mistake of building an army from guilt and calling it virtue. The mistake, above all, of letting a world that was supposed to be held in the Emperor's name slip from the Emperor's hands before anyone in a position of authority had paid close enough attention to notice it happening. But to understand any of that, you first have to understand Vraks. You have to understand what it was, and why it mattered, and why the Imperium was willing to spend 17 years and 14 million soldiers to take it back rather than simply remove it from the galaxy and start again somewhere else. Because the answer to that question is not the obvious one. The Imperium does not fight for sentiment. It does not bleed at this scale for any single world simply because the world was once Imperial and ought still to be. It fights for Vraks because Vraks was not simply a world. It was a vault. One of the largest vaults the Departamento Munitorum had ever commissioned, sitting in the Scaras sector of the Segmentum Obscurus, its every square kilometre of barren volcanic terrain undercut by warehouses and storage facilities and ammunition bunkers of such scale that the totality of what they contained was, in terms of raw military capability, enough to equip entire armies that had not yet been raised. Vraks Prime was an armoury world. The designation sounds dry when you say it plainly, as the Administratum's designations always do, but what it means in practice is something that rewards dwelling on. It means a world whose entire purpose in the Imperium's economy is to store the instruments of war, not to produce them, not to deploy them, simply to hold them in trust for the regiments and chapters and fleets and armies that would one day need them, keeping them clean and maintained and catalogued and ready, waiting with the patient permanence of mountains for the moment when the requisition order arrived from the Departamento Munitorum, and the convoy ships pulled up to the loading bays and the process of transfer began. The weapons stored on Vraks had come from dozens of worlds and hundreds of foundries across the Segmentum Obscurus, accumulated over centuries by the methodical operation of the Imperial supply chain, and they represented the kind of accumulated military potential that the Imperium could not easily replace if they were lost. Las rifles by the million, artillery shells by the billion, armoured vehicles waiting in sealed bays for crews who had not yet been assigned to them, void ship munitions, medical supplies, ration packs, engineering equipment, void suits, Vox equipment, and 1,000 other categories of material that the Departamento Munitorum tracked in its ledgers, and that the armies of the Imperium consumed in their campaigns. All of it was on Vraks. All of it was waiting. There was something else on Vraks too, something older and more significant to the people who lived there. The 8 million or so human and abhuman inhabitants who did not work in the warehouses but worked in the shadow of them, who had been born on Vraks and expected to die on Vraks, and whose entire experience of the Imperium was mediated through the specific quality of life that Vraks produced, which was not comfortable but which was, in the ways that mattered to the people living it, meaningful. On the highest point of the dead volcanic formation called the Van Meersland Plateau, on top of the fortified complex that the Departamento Munitorum called the Citadel and that the inhabitants called simply the Hill, there was a shrine, the Basilica of Saint Leonis the Blind, built centuries ago on the site where the saint was said to have performed the miracle of sight, where the pilgrims came from a dozen surrounding systems to pray and to feel, in the specific way that faith makes things felt, the presence of something larger than themselves, and the ordinary grinding difficulty of their lives. The pilgrim trade was the closest thing to genuine prosperity that Vraks had. The Labour Corps workers, those millions of indentured men and women whose lives were spent in the warehouses maintaining the equipment stored there, lived in conditions that the Departamento Munitorum considered adequate, and that the people living them experienced as grim. The atmosphere was sulphurous. The soil was dead volcanic pumice that produced nothing useful. The sky was the color of old iron, when it was visible at all beneath the chemical haze that the world's shallow seas breathed into the air. The cities were functional rather than beautiful, built to house workers rather than to give pleasure to the people housed in them, maintained to the minimum standard that the Administratum's regulations specified and not beyond it. But the basilica was beautiful. It had been built by people who understood that beauty matters to the faithful in ways that function does not. And it had been maintained and expanded over generations by the accumulated devotion of everyone who had passed through it, and been changed by what they found there. The pilgrims who arrived on the transports from other systems, sometimes 1 million at a time during the great feast days of the ecclesiastical calendar, brought with them the economic breath of an otherwise economically inert world. They also brought with them the specific quality of attention that faith focuses on its object. And the object on Vraks was a cardinal named Zaphon. To understand what happened on Vraks, you have to understand who Zaphon was before the war. Not the figure he became. Not the creature that the Imperial forces eventually found in the deepest chambers of the citadel when the siege was finally, at terrible cost, concluded. The man he had been. The man who had been loved. The man for whom those 8 million people and the 1 million pilgrims who came every year had felt the specific and genuine devotion that a preacher earns when he is actually good at his calling. He had been elevated to Cardinal Astra of the entire Scarus sector in the year 804 M41. Inheriting the office from his predecessor, Cardinal Borja, whose long tenure had kept the sector spiritually stable in the way that long tenures do when the tenant understands their office and applies it with wisdom. Zaphon had inherited Borgia's reputation and had spent the 5 years between his elevation and his seclusion on Vraks building on it, traveling through the sector on a pilgrimage that was simultaneously a pastoral visit to the faithful and a demonstration of his own devotion. He walked where he could. He distributed food from his own supplies when he encountered hunger. He prayed publicly and at length and with the specific quality of visible sincerity that people recognize and respond to. The quality that cannot be performed convincingly by someone who does not actually possess it. He was sincere. Whatever else Zaphon was, whatever he became, whatever choices led him from the man who walked barefoot into hungry villages to the thing that the Grey Knights eventually put down in the ruins of the basilica he had loved, he was at the beginning sincere. The faith was real. The love he felt for the people he was supposed to serve was real. The devotion to the Emperor that he expressed in every sermon, in every public prayer, in every act of personal sacrifice that he performed for the observation of the faithful, was not performance. It was the genuine article. And this, ultimately, is the most terrible thing about the Siege of Vraks. The thing that sets it apart from simple treachery or obvious corruption. The man who started the war was not a villain trying to deceive his way into power. He was a believer whose belief had found, in the specific conditions of Vraks in the year 812, a direction it should not have been permitted to take. He arrived on Vraks in 809 M41, choosing the shrine world as the base for what he described to his inner circle as a war of faith, a campaign of spiritual renewal that he intended to launch from the site of St. Leonis's miracle and carry outward through a sector that he had decided in the course of his 5-year pilgrimage needed something more than pastoral care. He had seen in those 5 years what the administratum's demands were doing to the ordinary people of the Scarus sector. The tithes, the levies, the requisitions of grain and material and young men and young women that the Departamento Munitorum extracted from worlds that were already providing everything they had and could not easily provide more. He had seen the hunger and the resentment and the quiet, grinding despair of populations that believed in the Emperor with their whole hearts and found, when they looked at the machinery of the Imperium that was supposed to be the Emperor's instrument on earth, something that felt less like divine governance and more like organized extraction. He was not wrong about this. The administratum's demands were excessive. The tithes were brutal. The conditions in the labor corps on Vraks itself were a specific and localized version of what he had seen across the whole sector. And the people who lived under those conditions were real people whose suffering was real, and whose faith, maintained despite that suffering, deserved better than the system was providing. This is the second terrible thing about the Siege of Vraks. The grievance was legitimate. The injustice that Zafan had identified and been moved by was not imaginary. And the movement he was building in response to it was, in the beginning, not heresy. It was reform, or the intention of reform, or the first stages of what reform looks like before it is tested by the resistance that entrenched power always brings to the ideas that threaten it. There was a man named Mammon. Deacon Mammon, a member of Zafan's inner circle, his principal advisor and the man who had been standing closest to him since before the pilgrimage began. The records that the Ordo Hereticus eventually compiled on Mammon, after the siege had made it clear what he had been doing and for how long, describe a figure who understood Zafan completely in the specific way that a patient manipulator understands the person they are manipulating, which is to say with the analytical clarity of someone who sees strengths and weaknesses without the emotional investment that makes seeing clearly difficult. Mammon knew what Zafan wanted. He knew what moved him, what frightened him, what gave him hope and what threatened it. He had been guiding those wants and fears with the kind of subtle precision that leaves no obvious fingerprints for the years between Zafan's arrival on Vraks and the moment when the Cardinal's plan was no longer a reform movement, but something the Ordo Hereticus could not mistake for anything except heresy. Where Mammon came from, what he was before he joined Zafan's staff, what power he served, and whether that service had begun before Vraks or developed there in the specific conditions that Vraks produced. The records do not fully resolve. What the records show is what Mammon was, in practice, which was the architect of a rebellion that consumed a world and killed 14 million soldiers, and very nearly opened a permanent gateway to the warp in the Scarus sector. He was patient. He was thorough. He worked with the available material, which was a sincere cardinal, a resentful population, and a world full of weapons, and he made from that material something that the ruinous powers could use. By the year A12 to M41, Vraks was ready. The disciples of Zafan, the inner circle that Mammon had refined and purged over 3 years, until they contained only those who were fully committed to what was coming, numbered 50,000. The PDF had been brought into the conspiracy, its officers replaced with men loyal to the Cardinal, or coerced into loyalty by the specific mechanisms that 50,000 armed and committed fanatics can bring to bear on those who are reluctant. The labor corps and the frateris militia and the population at large had been prepared with years of preaching that framed what was coming as the Emperor's will rather than its opposite. A liberation from the corrupt machinery of the administratum rather than a rebellion against the God Emperor himself. Most of those 8 million people did not know they were being led toward heresy. They thought they were being led toward justice. The distinction between the two, which should have been clear from the beginning, had been made deliberately unclear by the patient work of a man who understood that people will follow a leader toward almost anything if they believe that leader is following the emperor. The Ordo Hereticus had been watching Vraks. Their Vindicare assassin was already in position when the decision to act was made. The long-range shot was taken. It should have ended there, in the clean and economical way that the Officio Assassinorum ends things when everything works as intended. It did not work as intended. The Cardinal's Rosarius mounted refractor field caught the round. Zaphon lived. The attempt became the spark that ignited everything Mammon had been building toward, because the news of the assassination attempt presented to a population that had been prepared to receive it in exactly the worst possible way, turned 8 million people who had been passive supporters of a reform movement into active participants in an uprising. The Adeptus Arbites precinct was stormed. The master prefect of the Vraks administratum was killed. The Adepta Sororitas contingent of the Argent Shroud, those sisters who had accompanied Zaphon on his pilgrimage, and who were imprisoned the moment they showed signs of resistance, would not be freed for 17 years. The guns of the outer defense lines, which the Departamenta Munitorum had positioned to protect Vraks' strategic stockpiles, turned toward the sky and waited for the fleet that was coming. Because a fleet was coming, it would take time. The administratum had to determine what had happened, and then determine what to do about it, and then determine who would do it and with what forces. And all of that determination required time in the way that imperial bureaucracy always requires time, which is to say, more time than the situation could comfortably accommodate. But the fleet was coming. And when it arrived, it would not bring diplomats or mediators or the kind of institutional response that might, theoretically, have addressed the grievances that Zaphon had identified and reduced the population of Vraks from willing participants in a revolt to people who could be persuaded back to compliance. It would bring the Death Korps of Krieg, and the Death Korps of Krieg has no diplomats. To understand what the Death Korps is, you have to go to a world called Krieg, in the Segmentum Tempestus. And you have to understand what happened there in the year 403 of the 40th millennium. Krieg was at that point a prosperous hive world, governed by a council of autocrats in the manner that hive worlds have been governed since the earliest periods of the Imperium, which is to say, with the specific combination of order and exploitation that large urban civilizations tend to produce when the hierarchy of needs is answered for the few and ignored for the many. The High Autocrat of Krieg, whose name has been struck from every record that the Imperium maintains, by an edict of obliteration, whose purpose is not simply punishment but the specific theological statement that the name of a traitor should be unmade from history as thoroughly as the traitor's loyalty was unmade. From the emperor, declared independence, he renounced the emperor. He called the tithe unjust and the administratum tyrannical, and the Imperium a dying civilization that no longer deserved the loyalty it demanded. He was wrong about the conclusion, but perhaps not entirely wrong about the conditions. Krieg was a world where the hives had grown so large that the resources required to sustain them had become a perpetual crisis, and the tithe that the administratum extracted had for generations been calibrated to the edge of what was survivable and occasionally past it. The resentment that the high autocrat was able to mobilize was real. The suffering that underpinned it was real. The political calculation that this resentment could be turned into a viable independence movement was not entirely unreasonable, given the specific conditions of the 40th millennium. Not unreasonable, perhaps, but heretical. Completely, unambiguously, irredeemably heretical in the specific way that the renunciation of the emperor's authority is always heretical regardless of the political or economic conditions that produce it. And heresy in the Imperium has consequences that no amount of political calculation can make avoidable. The Loyalists held one hive Ferrograd, garrisoned by the 83rd Krieg Imperial Guard Regiment under a colonel named Jurten, became the last remaining Imperial position on a world that had gone entirely over to the secessionist faction. The order that Jurten received from Terra was to hold at all costs. No relief was promised. No timeline for reinforcement was provided. The order was simply to hold, which was either an expression of confidence in Jurten's capability or an acknowledgement that Terra had larger problems and Krieg had to solve its own, and which amounted in practice to the same thing. The 83rd Krieg was alone, surrounded, and expected to endure indefinitely. Jurten held. For years he held, while the secessionist forces hammered at Ferrograd's walls, and the siege took its steady toll, and the mathematics of attrition ran in the only direction that mathematics can run when one side has reinforcement and the other does not. And then, at a moment that the histories of Krieg describe with the specific reverence that is reserved for the actions of those who do terrible, necessary things for reasons the galaxy agrees are sufficient, Jurten made a choice. With the assistance of Archmagos Griel of the Adeptus Mechanicus, who understood the implications of what he was helping to unlock, Jurten opened a vault that the Adeptus Mechanicus had built into the deep foundations of Hive Ferrograd for exactly the kind of emergency that the Imperium prefers to pretend will never actually occur. The vault contained atomic weapons. On the feast of the Emperor's Ascension, the weapons were deployed, not against the secessionist armies specifically, not in the tactical sense of weapons targeted to achieve a precise military objective, against Krieg itself, against the cities, against the hive spires and the agricultural zones and the industrial districts and the population centers and everything else that a living world contains, and that an atomic bombardment does not distinguish between. The purging, as it came to be known, did not end the Civil War. The atmosphere collapsed into nuclear winter. The ecosystem retreated past the point of recovery. But the secessionist faction had built its own bunkers, and the war continued underground and in the ruins for nearly 500 years, grinding through generation after generation of soldiers on both sides, until the last of the secessionists were finally defeated, and Krieg was returned to the Emperor's embrace in 949 M40. 500 years of war, on a world that had already been reduced to a toxic, radioactive wasteland by the opening bombardment. 500 years of underground fighting, trench warfare in the ruins of hive cities, battles conducted in tunnels and corridors, and the shattered urban terrain of a civilization that had destroyed itself. 500 years of children born into this and knowing nothing else, of a society organized entirely around the production of soldiers, because soldiers were the only thing that mattered, of a culture shaped by the dual weight of the ancestral sin and the ancestral sacrifice, the guilt of the treason and the devotion of those who had refused it. The Death Korps of Krieg is what 500 years of that produces. It is a culture built from guilt and sustained by the specific theology that guilt generates when it is institutionalized across enough generations. The theology that says that the debt of the heresy can only be repaid in blood, and that the repayment can only be completed through the complete expenditure of everything the corps has to give, including the lives of every soldier it fields, and eventually the lives of the world's entire capable population if the Emperor's need requires it. They do not fight to survive, they fight to spend themselves, to take the guilt that Krieg's ancestors created and convert it one death at a time into the currency of atonement that the Emperor accepts in place of something less terrible. They are built like no other formation in the Astra Militarum. And by built I mean this literally, not as metaphor. Krieg uses accelerated birth programs that the Magos biologist finds deeply unpleasant to contemplate, producing soldiers at a rate that keeps pace with the losses that the Death Korps sustains in the wars it is sent to fight, which are always the worst wars, the ones that other formations cannot sustain, because the Death Korps will sustain anything. The Departamento Munitorum discovered, when it first began requesting regiments from Krieg, that the response to a tithe of 10 regiments would be an offer of 20, each of them specifically requesting the most hazardous assignment available. This is not bravery in the conventional sense. This is something colder and more absolute. The behavior of a culture that has decided it is already dead and is simply trying to complete the dying in as useful a fashion as possible. They wear greatcoats of chemically impregnated material, sealed against gas. They wear helmets fitted with the distinctive rebreather masks that have made them instantly recognizable across the galaxy. The blank-faced, tube-fitted visage that 100 enemy commanders have seen in the moment before the gas rounds fell, and the Krieg infantry advanced behind the expanding chemical. The masks are practical, on Krieg's sulfurous surface, and on the poison gas battlefields that their siege doctrine creates wherever they deploy. They are also, incidentally, a philosophical statement. Faceless, individual, each warrior a numbered entry in a regimental tally, each death a unit, each advance a line in the operational log that someone in the quartermaster cadre will annotate after the assault, whether there is anyone left to annotate it or not. The quartermaster cadre of the Death Korps deserves its own attention, because it is the element of the corps culture that most clearly expresses what the Death Korps understands itself to be. Where other guard regiments have apothecaries or medics who tend the wounded and try to preserve the lives of those who can be preserved, the Krieg have quartermasters who wear black with red lining and skull-faced masks and rib-cage plate armor, and who venture into no man's land not to rescue the wounded, but to perform the specific service that the Krieg call the Emperor's peace, which is a mercy killing administered to those who are wounded beyond the utility of further combat, followed by the systematic stripping of everything useful from the body. Weapons, ammunition, greatcoats, socks, everything is reclaimed for redistribution, because nothing is wasted in the corpse's accounting of itself. and the individual dead. Having contributed what they could contribute, are entered in the tally and released from further obligation. They do not retreat unless explicitly ordered. This is not a rule imposed by commissars. In most armies, the commissar exists to remind soldiers of their duty when the instinct towards self-preservation threatens to overcome it. In the Death Korps, the commissar exists to remind the soldiers that strategic withdrawal is sometimes necessary, and that dying where you stand when the line can be salvaged through tactical repositioning is wasteful, not heroic. The Krieg commissars are almost universally non-Krieg, drawn from other worlds, assigned to the corps because they possess the specific quality of judgment that the corps sometimes lacks, which is the ability to value a life enough to preserve it for a better moment of expenditure. They sing sometimes. The Death Korps, in the dark of the dugouts before an assault, when the artillery is running its preparatory barrage and the air smells of sulfur and cordite, and the specific organic smell of men who have been living in trenches for months. They sing the litany of sacrifice, or the portions of it that survive in the written records. The closing line is the most cited, because it is the most complete expression of what the Death Korps is in the fewest possible words. In life, war. In death, peace. In life, shame. In death, atonement. This is the force that the Imperium sent to Vraks. These are the men who would fight there for 17 years, who would build the greatest trench system in the history of the Segmentum Obscurus, who would die in the specific numbers that the actuarial calculation required, and then die in the additional numbers that the specific complications of Vraks required on top of that, who would advance across the Van Meersland wastes in the sulphurous murk of a dying world's bad atmosphere with their sealed masks and their long bayonets and their absolute indifference to personal survival, and who would eventually, at the cost of everything the calculation had specified and more, take the citadel back. The 143rd Siege Regiment departed Krieg in 8120M41. They were the vanguard. Behind them, in the months that followed, came 30 more regiments of their kind. The 88th Siege Army, organized into corps and army groups with the meticulous structure that the Departmenta Munitorum applied to formations of this scale, assembled in the Vraks system with the specific patience of a force that had calculated the war in advance and was prepared to execute it to the last decimal point of the calculation. The initial landing was contested from the moment the first shuttles broke atmosphere. The renegade PDF had the outer defense lasers charged and calibrated. The outer defense lines were manned by soldiers who, whatever else they had become, had been trained on Imperial doctrine and equipped with Imperial weapons, and who understood, with the specific knowledge that defenders always have of the terrain they are defending, exactly where the attackers had to go. The Krieg went anyway. The artillery prepared the ground as it could, which was not as well as it would eventually prepare it once the full siege train was in position. The infantry advanced across open ground under fire. The first assault waves took casualties that the operational reports described in the tone of a weather forecast, accurate and precise, and entirely without the register of feeling that the numbers being described might have been expected to produce. Thousands of men in the first days, tens of thousands in the first weeks. The tally was maintained. The advance continued, and the long, terrible, grinding accounting of the Siege of Vraks had begun. The Van Meersland wastes are not, in any conventional military sense, good ground to fight over. They are not good ground in any sense at all. They are hundreds of square kilometers of barren volcanic terrain, coated in the grey pumice and volcanic dust that Vraks' geological history produced, and then left undisturbed for the millions of years since the last eruption, broken only by outcroppings of volcanic rock that provide cover in the way that scattered boulders provide cover, which is to say imperfectly and without the kind of infrastructure that soldiers can use for anything except dying behind. The shallow sulfurous seas that cover the southern portion of the planet send their chemical breath across the wastes on the prevailing wind, mixing with the industrial haze from the processing facilities in the citadel's outer district to produce an atmosphere that the rebreathers filter adequately, but that registers in the lungs as something wrong regardless of what the filters indicate. The sky is the color of a bruise. The ground is the color of ash. The electrical storms that build over the inland sea and discharge across the wastes without warning are frequent enough that any exposed metal becomes a hazard when the lightning begins to walk across the plain. The Death Korps of Krieg looked at this ground and began to dig. The trench system that the 88th Siege Army constructed across the Van Meersland wastes over the first years of the campaign became eventually one of the most extensive military earthworks in the recorded history of the Scarus sector, and one of the longest in the segmentum obscurus outside of siege works dating to the Horus Heresy or older. The numbers require stating plainly because their scale is the most direct way of understanding what the Death Korps was doing and why, at the campaign's peak, the Imperial trench network extended across a front of more than 250 kilometers, running in 3 roughly parallel lines from north to south across the width of the wastes that the Imperial forces were contesting. Each line consisted of multiple parallel trenches connected by perpendicular communication trenches, with fire steps, weapons positions, dugouts, artillery emplacements, supply dumps, command posts, and the full infrastructure of a military civilization that expected to be in its current position for a very long time, and was building accordingly. The Death Korps builds trenches the way that other cultures build cathedrals, with the same combination of technical mastery and spiritual investment. The same understanding that what is being constructed is not simply functional but meaningful. That the work itself is a statement about what the builders believe and what they are committed to. A Krieg trench line is dug to a precise depth. The walls are reveated with timber and corrugated metal sheeting, salvaged from whatever the local terrain provides. The fire step is placed at the exact height that allows a standing rifleman to aim over the parapet without exposing more of himself than is tactically necessary. The drainage sumps are positioned to manage the water that will accumulate in the trench floor when the rains come, which on Vraks is not frequent, but when it comes is severe, torrential downpours that turn the volcanic dust to adhesive mud that bonds to boots and weapons and everything else, and makes movement across the ground a matter of will overcoming physics. The engineers work at night, mostly because the period between sunset and sunrise is when the defender's observation is poorest, and the ground between the lines can be advanced across at minimum cost. Mining teams push forward under the surface, extending the network toward the outer defense lines by meters per night. Meters that accumulate over months into hundreds of meters and eventually into kilometers. The sappers who lead these operations are the elite of the Death Korps engineering cadre. Men who have been selected for their ability to navigate underground in complete darkness, and who have spent their careers developing the specific combination of geological knowledge, structural engineering competence, and absolute calm that deep mining under enemy positions requires. The defenders know the mining is happening. They can hear it sometimes, the distant vibration conducted through the volcanic rock of the wastes when the Krieg teams are close enough. They countermine, pushing their own tunnels outward to intercept. And the two sets of miners occasionally meet in the dark beneath the surface, in the kind of close-quarters combat that neither side anticipated, but neither backs away from. Above the surface, the artillery exchanges never stop. The Death Korps siege train is the arm of the formation that most clearly expresses what the Corps understands about war, because siege artillery is the weapon of patience, the weapon of an army that has decided it will be where it is until the objective is taken, and that all the questions of how long and at what cost are secondary to the certainty of the eventual outcome. Earthshaker cannons, the workhorse of the Imperial artillery train, fire on the outer defense lines in patterns calculated to degrade specific positions over time, wearing down the concrete and the stone and the earthworks rather than trying to destroy them in single dramatic strikes. Medusa siege guns, those heavy howitzers with their shorter barrels and their high-angle fire, drop shells into the renegade trench lines on the far side of the outer defense ring. Heavy bombards, weapons so massive that they require days of preparation between engagements, lob shells the size of small vehicles onto specific hardened targets. The command bunkers and ammunition dumps and vehicle parks that the Krieg's observation teams have identified and passed to the battery commanders. The renegades return fire. The Vraksian traitors had the full contents of one of the largest Imperial armories in the sector available to them, which means they had artillery too. And their artillery was as well stocked as the Krieg's, and manned by soldiers who had received the same Imperial training that all PDF formations receive, and who understood the basic principles of counter-battery fire and defensive bombardment. In the first year, the artillery balance was relatively even, each side capable of inflicting significant damage on the other's forward positions, and making the ground between the front lines a continuous zone of exploding shells and flying metal that soldiers enter at the cost they have calculated in advance. The Krieg calculate this cost differently from most armies, but the cost is real regardless of how it is calculated, and the ground between the lines on Vraks is littered with the evidence of it. No man's land on Vraks is not simply empty ground. It is a terrain of wire and craters and the remnants of things, some of them equipment and some of them organic, that the battlefield has been accumulating since the first exchanges in 813 M41, and that neither side has been able to remove, because the removal of anything in no man's land requires exposure, and exposure is what kills. The Krieg quartermasters make their systematic expeditions into this terrain, moving in the brief windows of darkness and meteorological cover that the artillery pauses occasionally provide, recovering weapons and equipment and the bodies that can be reached. But the bodies that cannot be reached remain where they fall, and the shells that fall afterward contribute to the geography of the place in ways that defy easy categorization. No man's land on Vraks is the accumulation of 17 years of war, laid down in geological strata of violence, and it is one of the most detailed available records of what the siege cost. Marshal Soulke commanded the 88th Siege Army from its earliest deployment, and the records of his command are preserved in the Departamento Munitorum's archives, with the kind of completeness that suggests the Munitorum was always aware that this campaign would be reviewed extensively, and wanted the documentation to be unimpeachable. Soulke was not an incompetent officer. The Departamento Munitorum does not routinely appoint incompetent officers to commands of this scale, because incompetent officers tend to produce the kind of catastrophic outcomes that generate politically inconvenience. He was a capable administrator, a thorough planner, a general who understood the operational requirements of siege warfare in the way that a practitioner who has studied the theory but not yet been tested by the specific complications of the reality understands it. He ran the opening years of the campaign from the command facilities on Thracian Primaris, a world several systems distant from Vraks, conducting the siege by communication rather than by presence, which was not unusual for commanders of this rank, and which was not in itself the cause of the campaign's specific difficulties. The first major battle, the engagement that the campaign records designate the Battle of Fort A 453, came in the second year of the siege, in 814.M41, when the 30th Line Corps achieved the kind of breakthrough that the grinding preparatory work of the first year was intended to make possible. The outer defense lines at the designated sector had been degraded by continuous artillery bombardment and undermined by the engineering teams, and the 30th's assault troops went over the parapet and across the open ground and through the gap in the wire and into the enemy positions in the specific way that Krieg assault troops cross contested ground, which is without deviation, accepting what the ground costs, because the ground costs what it costs, and the Krieg have already decided in advance that they can afford it. The assault went in. The outer position fell. The Death Riders, those gas-masked cavalry who serve the corps as its exploitation force, came through the breach and ran down the retreating defenders across the pumice flats for several kilometers before the renegade reserve line closed the gap. Fort A 453 was the first genuine success of the campaign. It was celebrated in the operational dispatches with the restrained satisfaction of a formation that had expected eventually to succeed and had finally achieved the first evidence that the eventual was arriving on schedule. It was also, in retrospect, one of the most misleading indicators of how the campaign was going to proceed, because the achievement of the breakthrough was followed almost immediately by the kind of counter-offensive that fortified positions always generate when their outer lines are penetrated and the defenders have the reserves and the discipline to respond. The renegade PDF, trained on Imperial doctrine, launched its counterattack in the northern sector before the 30th Line Corps had fully consolidated its gains. And the fighting that followed was not the grinding attritional advance that the initial stages of the campaign had been, but something faster and more fluid, and correspondingly more costly for both sides. The Vraksians retook most of what the 30th had seized, establishing a new defensive line several hundred meters behind the original position that incorporated the damage the artillery had done to the first line into its defensive geometry. The Krieg fell back to maintain the integrity of their own lines. The front stabilized in a new configuration that was slightly different from the old one, but that produced, in operational terms, the same situation: two forces facing each other across contested ground, each one too strong to be dislodged by the other at acceptable cost, each one too committed to its current position to abandon it. The grinding resumed. The artillery resumed. The night mining resumed. The quartermasters moved through no man's land on their specific and necessary errands, and returned with tallies that the operational clerks entered in the ledgers that were transmitted to Thracian Primaris, and that Marshal Zelka reviewed with the calculated patience of a man who understood that this was going to take a long time, and who had arranged his mental framework around the acceptance of that long time in advance. What the Departamento Munitorum had not arranged for in its 12-year calculation of the campaign's duration and cost was the arrival of outside assistance for the defenders. The calculation had been conducted on the assumption that Vraks was a closed system, that the renegade forces were fixed in number and capability, that the world's distance from the Eye of Terror and the prevailing dispositions of void naval forces in the Scarus sector would prevent any significant reinforcement from reaching the defenders before the siege's conclusion. This assumption was wrong. It was wrong in ways that the administratum should perhaps have anticipated, given what was available to be known about the Eye of Terror's output when properly interrogated, but that the administratum had chosen not to contemplate because contemplating the possibility of Chaos Space Marine involvement in an armoury world revolt would have required revising the campaign. Projections in ways that the bureaucratic culture of the Departamento Munitorum found deeply uncomfortable. The discomfort did not prevent the arrival of the Chaos Space Marines. It simply meant that when they arrived, the Imperium's forces were not prepared for them. But before the Chaos warships began their approaches, there were years of the Van Meersland wastes in the specific quality of existence that trench warfare produces. The soldiers who lived it, those Death Korps regiments cycling through the front-line trenches in the rotation that siege operations permit, where the rear-line regiments rest and refit, while the forward regiments absorb the artillery and the counter-raids, and the slow daily toll of snipers and gas, and the accumulated physical degradation that living underground in toxic atmosphere while being regularly shot at produces, had an experience of the siege that no operational dispatch to Thracian Primaris fully captured. The dispatches captured the numbers. They did not capture the specific quality of the light in the Vraxian sky at false dawn, the peculiar chemical smell that the sulfur and the cordite and the rotting material in no man's land combined into when the wind was in the right direction, the sound that a heavy bombard shell makes when it passes overhead on its arc toward the citadel, the low vibration that settled into the bones after enough months of continuous artillery exposure, and that some veterans of the siege reported still feeling years afterward. They did not capture the patience, the specific Krieg patience, which is not the same as the patience of other soldiers who have learned to endure difficult conditions through force of will, but is something structural, something built into the culture from the beginning. The patience of beings who do not expect their lives to be comfortable, and who have therefore not organized themselves around discomfort as a problem to be solved, but as a condition to be worked within. The Krieg soldier in the trench waits for the assault order with the same face he presents at all other times, which is the face of the rebreather mask, sealed and featureless, revealing nothing about what is beneath it. Other units find this unsettling. Other units, when they are rotated into sectors adjacent to the Death Korps, report the specific unease of fighting alongside a force that does not behave the way soldiers behave, that does not express the fear and hope and the small daily negotiations with mortality that the experience of combat normally produces in human beings. The Krieg do not negotiate. They have already settled their accounts with mortality. The specific anxiety of the battlefield, the question of whether you personally will survive this specific engagement, is not a question that organizes Krieg behavior, because the answer, in the long run, has already been decided, and the long run is the only run that matters to a culture of atonement. There is a story, repeated in multiple accounts of the Vraks campaign with enough consistency that it has acquired the status of historical fact whatever its origins in specific incident, of a Krieg artillery lieutenant who called fire on his own trench position when the renegade assault overran his battery and there was no other way to prevent the guns from being captured. His name was Marot. The guns were destroyed. The trench position was destroyed. The renegades in it were destroyed. Marot was in it when the shells came down. He is listed in the regimental tally as a numbered entry, same as all the others. The report of the action notes his decision without particular emphasis, in the tone of the operational record that notes all decisions and their outcomes with equal weight. Because in the accounting of the Death Korps, a decision that preserves 2 artillery pieces from capture at the cost of a single soldier's life is simply a correct calculation, correctly executed. In the 9th year of the siege, the 468th Siege Regiment achieved the breakthrough that had been built toward for nearly a decade of grinding preparation. The second major defense line fell after a continuous artillery preparation of 48 hours, followed by a dawn assault in which the 468th took losses that the operational reports describe in the same even tone as all the others, and that the soldiers who participated in it and survived, a smaller number than the number who went over the parapet that morning, described in terms that the operational reports do not use. The second defense line was breached. The front moved. The tally was updated. And on the worlds adjacent to the Eye of Terror, in the dark spaces of the Skara sector's outer reaches, ships were moving that the Imperium's sensor networks had not yet identified, and whose arrival at Vraks would transform what was already a terrible war into something that the Administratum's 12-year calculation had not imagined, and that the Death Korps' 17-year endurance would be tested against in ways that the actuarial table had no column. 4. Arcos the Faithless arrived at Vraks, as he arrived everywhere, which is to say invisibly, and in advance of any recognition of his presence. He was a Chaos Lord of the Alpha Legion, a warrior whose connection to the 20th Legion traced back to the Horus heresy itself, to the days when the Legion's Primarchs had made their specific and peculiar calculation about the war's most likely outcomes, and had positioned themselves accordingly, and whose millennia of subsequent existence had been spent in the practice of the craft that the Alpha Legion elevated to a philosophy of war, which is the craft of deception conducted at a scale and with a thoroughness that makes the word deception inadequate to describe it. The Alpha Legion does not simply lie. The Alpha Legion constructs realities in which the truth that would inconvenience them is absent, replaced by alternative truths that serve their purposes, maintained by a web of agents and identities and false organizations so extensive that even those who know about the Alpha Legion's methods cannot always determine which of the elements they are examining is genuine and which is constructed. Arcos had been operating within the Skara sector for years before Vraks' revolt, long before Zafan's pilgrimage had begun, laying groundwork whose purpose even his own senior commanders may not have fully understood. He was called the Faithless, not because he lacked faith in whatever he served, but because those around him could never determine with confidence what that faith was directed toward, or whether what appeared to be faith was simply the most effective available mask for something entirely pragmatic. His warband, the Faithless, arrived at Vraks in the 20th year of the campaign, which is to say in 820 M41, 7 years into what the Administratum had expected to be a 12-year war, and 3 years past the point at which the Departamento Munitorum's projections had suggested the siege would be entering its final phase. They arrived not as an invading fleet, but as what appeared to be loyalist space marines, because the Alpha Legion's infiltration capabilities extended to the procurement and use of loyalist armor and markings, and because the Vraks system's defensive sensors had been calibrated for Chaos warship profiles, and had been designed around the assumption that anything that looked like a loyal Imperial force was a loyal Imperial force. They were inside the defensive perimeter before the identification that would have stopped them could be made. And by then it was too late to stop anything. Arcos's warriors moved through the outer districts of the citadel's surrounding areas with the specific confidence of forces that have already studied the terrain they are operating in, which they had, through the network of agents that Mammon's patient work and Arcos's own preparatory intelligence operations had built into Vraks' renegade apparatus over the years. They trained the militia. They improved the defensive positions in ways that the PDF's own engineering capability had not been able to achieve. They introduced tactical sophistication to the renegade conduct of the war that the Death Korps' opposition had been somewhat lacking in, because sophisticated tactics require sophisticated training, and the Vraksian renegades, however well equipped they were from the armoury, had been trained to Imperial Guard standard, and not beyond it. What Arcos brought to Vraks was not simply military capability. He brought the specific Alpha Legion gift for seeing the shape of a war at a level of analysis that most commanders, even very good ones, do not routinely access. He saw what the Imperium was doing and why. He saw where the 88th Siege Army's operational plan was strong and where it was vulnerable, not in the tactical sense of identifying weak points in the defense lines, but in the deeper sense of identifying the assumptions on which the entire campaign was based and assessing which of those assumptions were false. He identified the Departamento Munitorum's failure to account for external reinforcement of the defense as the central strategic vulnerability, and he began to exploit it. His sorcerers sent calls through the warp, not loudly, not in the manner of a beacon that could be detected by the Imperial astropathic networks, but in the specific and carefully modulated way that Alpha Legion communications operated, reaching the warbands and renegade forces in the eye-adjacent regions of the Skara sector that Arcos had been cultivating as potential assets for exactly this kind of moment. The call said that Vraks had an armoury's worth of weapons and the defenders of a world that had already held against the Imperium's best siege troops for 7 years, and that the opportunity for Chaos to turn a significant Imperial asset into a significant Chaos one was present, and required only the kind of reinforcement that a properly motivated Chaos warband could provide. The response came in 821.M41. Not from one warband, from 11. The Dark Angels arrived first, not as a response to Arcos, but as an expression of a completely separate Imperial calculus that demonstrates how many different purposes a single war can serve simultaneously. Supreme Grandmaster Azrael, accompanied by half the Dark Angels chapter, arrived in the Vraks system before the Chaos counter-offensive had fully developed, which meant their arrival predated the most extreme crisis of the campaign. They attacked the orbital starport that served as the primary interface between the Vraks system and void traffic, the facility whose capture would give the Imperium control over who and what could reach Vraks from orbit. The battle for the starport lasted 8 days. The Dark Angels fought with the concentrated intensity of a chapter that understands how to take defended urban positions, and has the specific gene seed-derived gifts that make Space Marine combat so different in quality from anything the Krieg's regiments could bring to a comparable engagement. They took the starport. 200 Marines were lost in the taking of it. Why did Azrael come to Vraks with half his chapter? The Departamento Munitorum's records attribute the deployment to the siege's escalating severity and the value of having Space Marine quality on hand for specific breakthrough operations. The Departamento Munitorum's records do not mention the other reason, which was that the Alpha Legion was on Vraks, and the Dark Angels have their own very specific interest in any operation that presents the possibility of capturing a senior Alpha Legion commander. Arcos was eventually captured at the siege's end by the Angels of Absolution, a Dark Angels successor chapter. He was taken to the Rock, the Dark Angels' mobile fortress monastery, for interrogation. The Dark Angels' interrogation methods and their specific interest in what Arcos might know are matters that belong to a different story. But their presence at Vraks and the losses they sustained there were driven at least in part by an agenda that the Departamento Munitorum was not privy to, and would not have approved of if it had been. The reinforcements for the renegades arrived in their turn, and the Chaos counter-offensive that followed is the point in the Siege of Vraks at which the Administratum's 12-year calculation was not simply delayed, but effectively abandoned. The Chaos Warfleet that materialized in the Vraks system in the period around 821 M41 was not simply a collection of warships. It was a fleet that had been assembled by Arcos's specific call from the specific warbands that the call had been calibrated to reach, each one bringing its own capabilities and its own agenda, and its own relationship to the specific powers of the warp that had shaped them in the millennia since the heresy. The World Eaters came, the Skull Takers, a cornate warband whose origins traced back through the labyrinthine post-heresy lineage of the 8 legions remnants to warriors who had been fighting in the cornate manner for so long that the fighting had become indistinguishable from what they were rather than what they did. Descended on Vraks in drop pods and dreadclaws through the starport's orbital window, landing in the northern sectors with the specific quality of assault that cornate warriors bring to urban combat, which is total. They did not seize ground in the military sense of establishing a perimeter and holding it against counterattack. They moved through ground in the specific way that a flood moves, consuming everything in the immediate path, and leaving behind a landscape that the defenders who had occupied it, and the Krieg who had been trying to push through it, would both find unrecognizable. The Death Guard came, 4 distinct warbands of Nurgle's servants, each with its own specific character and its own specific capabilities, and its own specific contribution to the particular horror of chaos warfare. Arrived and deployed across different sectors of the front, bringing with them weapons and organisms and energies that the Death Korps' chemical protection could partially, but not completely address. The Apostles of Contagion, led by a sorcerer named Necrosius the Undying, deployed a weapon called TP3, an acidic gas compound whose specific chemical signature was calibrated to penetrate the filter specifications of the Krieg rebreathers, and used it in concentrated form in the enclosed trench environments of the southern sector, with results that the Krieg operational. Records describe in the careful, neutral language of catastrophe. The 19th Siege Regiment, trapped in its trench positions when the gas attack came and unable to retreat because the positions behind them had been cut off, was annihilated. Not simply destroyed as a fighting formation, annihilated. Consumed in what Necrosius and his warband apparently regarded as a ritual sacrifice, a gift of souls to Nurgle executed in the specific manner that Nurgle's theology approves of. They raised the dead, the unburied dead of the 19th, and the renegade forces they had been fighting became something that was no longer dead in any useful sense of the word. Animated by Nurgle's specific gift of persistence, moving through the trench systems that they had previously occupied in a capacity that the Krieg had to deal with using weapons and tactics that the Corps' training had not specifically prepared them for. The Iron Warriors came, less spectacularly but more structurally, bringing their specific combination of siege expertise and chaos engineering to the renegade fortifications in ways that made the already formidable outer defense lines significantly more formidable. The Steel Brethren, as the relevant Iron Warriors elements were designated, understood fortification in the way that the Death Korps understood it, which is to say from the inside, as an expression of a tactical philosophy rather than simply as a physical structure. And the improvements they made to the Vraxian defense lines reflected that understanding in ways that the 88th Siege Army's forward commanders found, on their next assault attempts, deeply inconvenient. The Black Brethren of Arius, a Black Legion warband, contributed the specific resource that a Black Legion element in a Chaos Coalition provides, which is the nominal authority of Abaddon's patronage and the political weight that comes with it. The Skulltakers and the Death Guard warbands were not natural allies. Left entirely to their own dynamics, they would have competed as intensely for resources and territory within the Vraks perimeter as they competed with the Krieg outside it. The Black Brethren's presence was in part a stabilizing mechanism, a reminder that someone with genuine authority had taken an interest in this campaign, and that the various Chaos factions needed to maintain enough operational coherence to actually achieve the campaign's objectives. It did not entirely work. The Chaos Coalition on Vraks was never fully coordinated in the way that the Arcos plan had theoretically envisaged. But it was coherent enough to transform a war that the Death Korps had been winning slowly into a war that the Imperium was suddenly losing quickly. The macro-cannon orbital bombardment from the Chaos warships struck the 88th Siege Army's rear areas at the same time that the ground assault from the reinforced renegade forces struck its forward lines. And the combination produced the specific military catastrophe that two simultaneous crises produce when the force experiencing them has the capability to deal with one, but not both at once. The Krieg's rear installations, the logistics nodes and artillery parks and reinforcement staging areas that the patient years of siege infrastructure had built up, were hit by orbital fire that the Krieg had no air defense capable of addressing. The forward lines were hit by reinforced renegade assaults that the berserkers of Skalathrax spearheaded in the manner of world eaters at their least restrained. Lines that had been held for years were penetrated, and some were broken. Corps that had been conducting methodical siege operations found themselves conducting improvised defensive actions in terrain that had previously been their rear areas. Marshal Sulki's response to this crisis, conducted from Thracian Primaris by communication rather than by presence, was assessed by the Departamento Munitorum's subsequent review as competent in its individual components and inadequate in its totality, which is the specific language that the Departamento uses when it has decided to relieve a commander and wishes to document the reasons without being unkind. He was relieved. Marshal Amim Kargori was appointed in his place, and Kargori's first act was to travel to Vraks personally, to stand in the battered command posts and walk the surviving trench systems and assess the situation with the specific authority of someone who could see it rather than receiving reports about it, and to conclude that the campaign required something more than a change in command to recover. It required time, more time than the administratum had budgeted, more men than the casualty projections had accounted for, and eventually things that the Departamento Munitorum could not provide from its own resources. The battle fleet Scarus, reorganized after the initial Chaos Fleet actions had degraded its capacity, fought the second battle of the Vraks system and retook orbital supremacy, crippling Arcos's flagship Anarchy's heart in the process, and denying the Chaos Coalition the orbital fire support that had been one of its most significant tactical advantages. The Legio Astorum, those Titan legionnaires whose gold and blue walking engines had been committed to the campaign in support of the Death Korps, found themselves engaged in something that Titan warfare had rarely been called on to produce, which was sustained combat against the traitor Titan engines that the Legio Vulcanum had brought to Vraks. Engines possessed by entities of the warp whose theological status the Mechanicus found deeply disturbing, and whose combat effectiveness was unfortunately not diminished by that status. The Legio Astorum fought 12 of the Legio Vulcanum's engines during the campaign's worst period. 9 were killed. 12 of the enemy were killed. The accounting that the Titan legions apply to these exchanges is the same patient arithmetic that the Death Korps applies to everything else on Vraks, and it arrived at the same conclusion, which is that the side which replaced its losses faster was going to win. The Death Korps replaced their losses. The 46th Line Corps, 3 additional Krieg regiments, arrived in 821, M41, and the reinforcement was the beginning of a recovery that Kargori built carefully over the following years. Trading ground for attrition in the sectors where attrition favored the Imperium, and defending aggressively in the sectors where it did not. He launched the tunneling campaign that came to be known as the War Beneath Vraks, deploying the engineering companies in a new strategic role rather than simply a preparatory one, attempting to use the underground terrain that Vraks's volcanic geology provided as a means of bypassing the surface fortifications that had so far absorbed the cost of every frontal assault. It worked sometimes. The engineers reached positions that the surface assault could not reach. They placed charges under renegade fortifications and detonated them in ways that the Vraksian defenders had not anticipated, and had not built their defensive geometry to address. The tunnels provided cover for troop movements that the orbital observation and the artillery would have made impossibly costly on the surface. The war beneath Vraks was not a shortcut to victory. Kargori understood that no shortcut existed and did not build his recovery plan around finding one. It was a supplementary pressure, another vector of advance added to the existing vectors, another way of making the defenders' problems slightly harder and the attackers slightly less impossible. And in a war of attrition, anything that improves the ratio by even a small amount is worth the cost of achieving it. The years passed. The tally grew. The front, surveyed from the operational maps that Kargori's staff updated daily in the command center at the renovated starport, moved with the slowness of geological processes, its advances measured in the hundreds of meters that translated to the thousands of lives that the Corps's calculations specified as the price of those meters. The Van Meersland wastes accumulated their history in the only way that a landscape of this kind can accumulate history, which is in layers of destruction, the older craters filled in by weather and by the deliberate engineering of both sides, the newer ones raw and sharp-edged, the whole surface of the contested zone built up into a terrain that bore almost no relationship to the volcanic plain that had existed before the war, and that would require centuries of geological time to return to anything resembling it. In the citadel, something was changing that Kargori's maps did not show, because maps do not track spiritual states, only territorial ones. The Chaos Space Marines who had arrived to reinforce and then to dominate the defense of Vraks had changed the nature of what was happening inside the citadel's walls in ways that Cardinal Zaphon had not foreseen when he had imagined his war of faith and the Deacon Mammon's patient. Guidance had not planned for, because Mammon's guidance had planned for the specific outcome that Mammon's specific master wanted, and that outcome was not the one that Zaphon had been sold. The Cardinal was becoming irrelevant. The warlords who had arrived in his name and for his cause were pursuing objectives that had nothing to do with his theology of imperial reform, and everything to do with the appetites of the chaos gods and the specific ambitions of the men who served those gods. Zaphon's authority over the defense had been theoretical almost since the first Chaos Space Marines arrived. It was becoming, by the middle period of the war, entirely nominal, a puppet figure maintained, because the renegade population still responded to his name and his image, and removing him entirely would have required an explanation that would have complicated the Chaos Warlords' management of the civilian collaborators they were relying on. He preached less. He appeared in public less. The man who had been a living saint to 8 million people was retreating, not in the tactical sense, but in the human sense, into whatever space his deteriorating psychology was still capable of sustaining. And there was a third figure waiting in the wings, not yet arrived, not yet committed, but already named in the Inquisition's intelligence assessments as a significant concern. A Chaos Lord of extraordinary capability and extreme violence, whose deployment to Vraks would transform the war again in a direction that Kargori's recovery was building toward, but had not yet had to face in its full expression. His name was Jufor the Impaler. Jufor the Impaler commanded a World Eaters warband called the Skull Takers, and the name of the warband is an accurate description of its operational doctrine, in the same direct way that the name World Eaters is an accurate description of what the 8th Legion's Cornate inheritance produced. He had not always been a World Eaters champion. The records that the Ordo Hereticus compiled on him, cross-referenced with the fragmentary documents that the Dark Angels and the Red Scorpions recovered from Vraks during their respective operations there, trace his origin to a stormtrooper regiment, and then to the Adeptus Astartes, and then to the specific catastrophe of Khorne's influence on a warrior who had been built for extreme violence, and who had found in the Chaos God's attention both the release from restraint that violence without purpose becomes, and the specific channeling of that violence that Khorne's doctrine provides. He came to Vraks not because Arcos called for him. He came because Abaddon the Despoiler had sanctioned the Skulltaker's deployment, and Abaddon's strategic calculus about Vraks was different from Arcos's tactical calculus in important ways. Arcos had wanted to hold the armoury world and use it as a base of operations against the broader Scarus sector. Abaddon wanted the armoury world's weapons and the attrition that the siege was inflicting on the Scarus sector's Imperial forces, and he wanted it as part of a longer-term preparation for what would eventually become the 13th Black Crusade. Zuffa was Abaddon's instrument of this calculus, deployed not to support Arcos's strategy, but to redirect the campaign toward an outcome that served the Despoiler's purposes. The specific form that this redirection took was a coup. Zuffa arrived and fought, and in the fighting demonstrated to the other Chaos warlords on Vraks the kind of capability that establishes authority in the specific social hierarchy of a Chaos coalition, which is the hierarchy of demonstrated personal lethality. He challenged the Lord of the Berserkers of Scalathrax to a duel and killed him, and absorbed the Berserkers into the Skulltaker's operational structure. He brought the Black Brethren of Areus into alignment through a combination of political pressure from Abaddon's name and the straightforward intimidation of a warrior who had just demonstrated his willingness to murder a rival champion in front of witnesses. He had the Sanctified, those word-bearers daemonancers whose specific role in the coalition was the ritual preparation of the warp conditions that more dramatic events would later require, and whose cooperation he needed and could not simply bully into place, come to their own accommodation with the New Order through the logic that the New Order had Abaddon's blessing and the Old Order had not delivered on its promises. Deacon Mammon, who had orchestrated the entire rebellion from the beginning and who had managed to maintain his position through the arrival of first Arcos and then the other warbands by making himself useful to each successive dominant power, saw Zuffa's rise and made the calculation that his best chance of survival was to place himself under the protection of a patron who could guarantee it. He chose Nurgle. Or Nurgle chose him, which may be the more accurate description of what happens when a being of Mammon's specific character and specific history and specific accumulated guilt presents itself in proximity to the Lord of Decay's servants. He joined the Death Guard warbands. He underwent whatever transformation Nurgle's specific blessing produces in those who accept it. He became something that the reports of the campaign's final stages describe with a specificity of horror that suggests the authors had encountered it directly. A daemon prince in Nurgle's service, rewarded for his decades of patient service to the corruption of Vraks, with the specific reward that Nurgle offers his champions, which is the completion of the decay that their mortal lives had been in the process of achieving. Zaphon, the Cardinal, the man of faith, the living saint of 8 million people, the pilgrim preacher who had walked barefoot into hungry villages and given from his own supply, was at this point a prisoner in his own citadel. Zuffa had him arrested, his remaining loyal guards killed or scattered, his access to the radio and Vox networks that had allowed him to communicate with the defense forces cut. He was put in the dungeons of the basilica that he had loved more than anywhere on Vraks, and that Zuffa had converted from a shrine into a slaughterhouse without particular ceremony or sentiment. What happened to Zafan in those dungeons, in the years between his imprisonment and the eventual fall of the citadel, is documented in the operational reports of the Red Scorpions and the Grey Knights, who were among the first Imperial forces to reach the inner chambers. The documentation is brief. The Ordo Malleus declassified a portion of it after the campaign, and what the declassified portion describes is a man in the final stages of the specific transformation that chaos produces in those who have given themselves to it without understanding or consenting to what the giving means. He was still alive, technically, when the Imperial forces found him. He was no longer, in any meaningful sense, anything that had once been Zafan. The Commissar General of the 88th Siege Army was a man named Moore. He had served the Krieg in the specific inverted role that Krieg commissars occupy, spending years as the restraining intelligence rather than the disciplinary authority. The man who provided the external perspective that the Death Korps' total commitment to sacrifice sometimes required in order to avoid wasteful expenditure of lives in directions that served no strategic purpose. He was present at the battle for Gate 579459, one of the final assault's most costly engagements, when the Krieg made their push for the inner ring of the Citadel's defenses. He was killed in that battle by Zuffa personally. The Chaos Lord took his body and mounted it on his Terminator armor as a trophy in the specific Kornate tradition of honoring worthy kills, and the image of a commissar's body worn by a World Eaters champion became one of the most widely reproduced images of the Vraks campaign in the aftermath, used by the Ordo Malleus in their materials documenting the campaign's costs, and by the Death Korps in their own regimental histories, as an image of the specific quality of enemy they had been asked to fight. Inquisitor Lord Hector Rex arrived at Vraks in 830.M41, the 17th year of the siege. His arrival was not a surprise to those with access to the Ordo Malleus's operational intelligence, which had been monitoring the warp conditions around Vraks with increasing concern as the Sanctified's ritual work progressed, and the specific signature that large-scale daemonic summoning produces in the warp's surface tension began to register on the instruments that the Ordo maintained. For exactly this kind of monitoring, Rex arrived because the instruments had told him that Vraks was approaching the moment at which what was happening there would exceed the Departamento Munitorum's ability to address it. He arrived to be present at that moment, and to ensure that it did not produce the specific outcome that the Sanctified was preparing for it. He was extraordinary in the way that the most senior servants of the Ordo Malleus are sometimes extraordinary, which is to say that his capability exceeded the conventional classification of what an Inquisitor is and does by a margin that made him less a representative of an institution and more a phenomenon of a particular category of human potential pushed to an extreme that most humans never approach, and very few survive the approach to. He was a psyker of exceptional power. He had been enhanced physically in ways that gave him the size and strength of an Astartes without the gene seed's involvement, a process that the Ordo Malleus's resources and traditions make available to a very small number of Inquisitor lords. and that produces results as impressive as they are expensive. He carried a force sword named Arias, anointed according to the Ordo Malleus's specific rites, capable of disrupting the psychic substance of demonic entities in ways that conventional weapons cannot. He had consulted the Emperor's tarot before taking command at Vraks, and the tarot had warned him, in the specific and deniably metaphorical language that the tarot uses, that the risk of Vraks becoming a daemon world was real and was not theoretical. He took command of all Imperial forces on Vraks. The Grey Knights arrived from Titan under Brother Captain Arvan Stern. The Red Scorpions under Lord High Commander Varant Ortiz, the Red Hunters in support, and the 88th Siege Army, tired and reduced from 17 years of grinding expenditure, but still capable and still present, organized itself under the Inquisitor Lord's authority for the final push that Rex had arrived to lead. The Murder Slopes. This is what the Death Korps called the approaches to the Citadel's final defensive ring, the ground that sloped upward from the outer trench systems toward the base of the volcanic formation that the Citadel sat atop, where the defenders had the high ground, the pre-prepared firing positions, the clear fields of fire, and all the other advantages that defenders at the top of a slope hold over attackers climbing toward them. The name was accurate. The assaults up those slopes cost more per meter than any previous phase of the campaign, because the topography that Vrax's geology had produced at this specific location made the attacker's situation worse and the defenders better than at almost any other point on the circuit of the Citadel. 3 assaults were launched and partially repelled before the 4th achieved the breakthrough that allowed the forward forces to establish a foothold on the defensive ring's upper tier. Hangman's Hill was the last elevated observation and fire control position that the renegades held before the Citadel's void shields came down. It was named with the specific directness that soldiers use when they are naming places where a lot of people died, for what the Vraxian defenders had done to the Krieg prisoners they had taken during the campaign. The hill was defended in depth, with interlocking fields of fire and reinforced bunkers of a quality that demonstrated the Iron Warriors' engineering contribution to the renegade defenses. It was assaulted 3 times, and held all 3 times before the 4th assault, prepared with the full weight of the remaining Legio Astorum Titans, and a continuous artillery bombardment that Kargori's staff had been planning for months, achieved the objective and cleared the hill. With Hangman's Hill taken and its observation equipment in Imperial hands, the artillery could be corrected onto the void shield generators with the precision that had not been available when the generators were concealed behind the hill's masking terrain. The generators failed over the course of 48 hours of concentrated fire from every artillery piece the 88th Siege Army could bring to bear. The shields went down. The Citadel's outer walls, which the void shields had protected from everything that the siege had been able to throw at them, were now subject to direct fire from weapons that had been waiting for this moment for the better part of 2 years. The 30th Line Corps went in. The battle inside the Citadel's outer walls was unlike anything that had preceded it in the siege. Not because it was more violent than the trench warfare of the preceding years, but because the scale of it was compressed into the specific geometry of an urban environment, rather than spread across the vast plain of the Van Meersland wastes. Streets and corridors rather than trenches and open ground. Rooms and basements rather than bunkers and dugouts. The Death Korps moved through these environments with the same methodical patience they had brought to the Van Meersland wastes, each building cleared by the same process of grenades and bayonets, and the application of flamer to spaces that could not be otherwise cleared. While the fighting above the street level produced casualties that dropped through the floors onto the soldiers fighting in the buildings below, the Death Guard sectors were the worst. The zones that the Apostles of Contagion and the other Nurgle warbands controlled had been transformed, over the years of their occupation, into something that the Ordo Malleus classified as Nurglite corruption of the physical environment, a technical designation that inadequately describes the specific quality of a series of corridors and chambers that had been converted by Nurgle's servants into a landscape of organic matter, living and dead and intermediate between the two, where the walls were not stone anymore and the floor was not uniform and the air was not breathable through standard filters, and where the things that moved were not always clearly distinguishable from the things that did not. The 30th Line Corps named this zone the Green Hell, a name that required no explanation to anyone who had passed through it. They cleared it. The cost was what it was. The Sanctified opened the warp, the word-bearers daemonancers who had been working toward this moment. Since before the Chaos Coalition's arrival had been preparing the ritual, conditions for a summoning of a scale that the Ordo Malleus's instruments had been detecting for months, and that Rex had come to Vraks, specifically to prevent. They did not complete the preparation before Inquisitor Rex's forces reached them, but they completed enough of it. 2 warp rifts opened within the citadel, in the depths of what had once been the Basilica of St. Leonis the Blind. Angrath came through the first. The records of the Ordo Malleus on the subject of Angrath the Unbound are extensive and classified at the highest available clearance, because what the records contain is sufficiently disturbing that the Ordo's standard operating procedure is not to distribute it more widely than the specific operational need requires. What can be said within the broader record is that Angrath is designated in the Ordo's taxonomy as a bloodthirster of the most extreme category, a greater daemon of Khorne of a potency that the Ordo Malleus reserves its most senior Inquisitor Lords to address when they manifest. It came through the rift in the Basilica's lower levels and moved upward through the citadel with the specific quality of speed and destruction that a being of this category produces when it is given a crowded space and no constraints on its expression. It killed a Grey Knights and Red Hunters strike force that attempted to intercept it before it could reach the main body of the battle, including Brother Captain Arturus, and came into the presence of Inquisitor Lord Rex. The records of the engagement between Rex and Angrath are brief and consistent across the accounts that survived the engagement's immediate aftermath. Rex fought it. He used Arius, the Force Sword, and the specific knowledge of demonic vulnerabilities that the Ordo Malleus's tradition had encoded in that blade, and in the decades of Rex's own study and experience. He banished it. The banishment took everything he had, and the brief documentary fragments that describe Rex in the immediate aftermath describe a man who had been reduced to the edge of what was sustainable, but who was still functional, still present, still capable of the next thing. The next thing was Zoofor's escape, the World Eater's lord, understanding that the Citadel's fall was now a matter of hours rather than days, and that the rift he and the Sanctified had intended to use as a permanent gateway to the warp was instead being closed behind him. Used the remaining warp conduit to remove himself and the core of his forces from Vraks before the Imperial encirclement was complete. He left a rear guard, The rearguard was consumed. Zuffa himself escaped, which the Officio Assassinorum has since noted in its operational files as one of 4 occasions on which warranted assassination attempts against this specific target have failed, which is a record that suggests the target's capacity for operational security and the specific difficulty of the mission, rather than any deficiency in the Officio's personnel. The second rift produced Uraka Asbaramael, a cornate daemon prince, whose specific designation the Ordo Malleus records as the Warfiend, accompanied by daemon warriors in sufficient numbers to represent a genuine threat to the Imperial forces clearing the citadel's final sections. Brother Captain Arven Stern of the Grey Knights led the engagement against fought and banished it, and then turned the specific psychic capability that the Grey Knights exist to deploy on the rift itself, sealing it in the manner that the Grey Knights training produces in those who have the specific combination of psychic ability and spiritual conditioning the process requires. The rift closed. The demonic incursion ended. The citadel's remaining defenders, their supernatural support withdrawn, were surrounded and systematically eliminated in the final hours of the battle. They found Zaphon in the lower chambers of the Basilica, in the dungeons where Zuffa had put him years before. They found what he had become. The Ordo Malleus's report uses the clinical designation Chaos Spawn for what they found, which is the correct classification for a being in whom the transformation wrought by proximity to and service of the ruinous powers has proceeded past the point where any consistent identity or physical form can be sustained. He was not dead. He was not alive in any sense that the medical tradition of the Imperium would recognize as involving a self or a soul, or anything that could be meaningfully addressed by the Emperor's justice. He was simply present, a biological artifact of what had once been a cardinal of the Skara sector, the living end state of a faith that had found in the wrong direction more room to run than it could have if it had found the right one. The Argent Shroud sisters, who had been imprisoned since the revolt's first days, were found in the same complex. They had survived. Their survival was one of the very few things about the Battle of the Citadel that the operational reports described without the specific neutral tone of an accounting document. They had survived 17 years of imprisonment in conditions that the sisters' own testimony, provided in the inquisitorial debriefings that followed, described with a completeness that the Ordo Hereticus found valuable for its documentation of the specific forms that chaos inflicts on the faithful it captures. They were given back to their order. They were the only living inhabitants of the inner citadel when the Imperial forces completed their clearing operation. Other than the thing, the siege ended on 414830.M41. The Departamento Munitorum's formal record of conclusion carries that date. The campaign lasted 17 standard Terran years. The Death Korps of Krieg lost 14 million soldiers. The Legio Astorum lost 9 Titans. 4 Inquisitors died in the campaign. Hundreds of Space Marines were killed across the Dark Angels, Angels of Absolution, Red Scorpions, Red Hunters, and Grey Knights operations. The renegade forces suffered casualties in the millions, and the 8 million inhabitants of Vraks Prime who had not been killed in the fighting or died of other causes during the siege's 17 years were by the siege's end consumed in the violence or exterminated in the aftermath of the Ordo Malleus's purification campaign, because the level of chaos corruption that 17 years of chaos coalition occupation had inflicted on the population was not, in the Ordo's assessment, compatible with any pathway back to the Emperor's service. Inquisitor Lord Rex declared Vraks Perdita and placed it under Ordo Malleus interdiction. The designation Perdita in the Inquisition's classification system means a world that has been judged so thoroughly corrupted that it cannot be reclaimed for the Imperium and must instead be quarantined, kept under observation to ensure that nothing escapes from it into the surrounding systems, and denied to both sides as a useful asset in perpetuity. Vraks was not reclaimed as a functioning armoury world. The weapons stored there, the billions of rounds and millions of vehicles and endless catalogued reserves that the Departamento Munitorum had spent centuries accumulating, were consumed in the fighting, corrupted by the chaos presence, or destroyed in the purification operations. The strategic resource that the Imperium had spent 17 years and 14 million lives reclaiming did not exist in any usable form when the reclaiming was complete. The Imperium won the Siege of Vraks in the sense that the Chaos Coalition was expelled and the world was denied to Chaos as a permanent base of The Imperium won it in the sense that Inquisitor Rex banished Angrath, and Stern sealed the rift and the specific catastrophe of a daemon world in the Skara sector's inner ring was averted. It did not win in any other sense that matters, at the level of what the word winning usually means. The cost exceeded the value of the recovered asset. The world that had existed before the siege did not exist afterward. The armoury that the campaign had been designed to reclaim was gone. The Administratum's 12-year calculation had produced a 17-year war at a cost that the calculation had not estimated, and for an outcome that the calculation's framing had not prepared it to accurately describe. What does it mean? What does the Siege of Vraks tell us about the Imperium, about the galaxy, about the specific quality of existence that the 41st millennium has produced, and that 10,000 years of post-heresy civilization has been unable to improve in any fundamental way? It tells us several things, and none of them are comfortable. It tells us that faith, without wisdom, is a door through which chaos enters. Not because faith is wrong, not because the love that the people of Vraks felt for their cardinal was misplaced, or because the desire for justice that drove 8 million people to follow a preacher's call for reform was illegitimate. Faith can be right and still be manipulated. Love can be genuine and still be used. The desire for justice is one of the most human things that human beings can feel, and the Chaos Gods are very good at finding the desire for justice and redirecting it toward their own purposes. Because the desire for justice contains within it the willingness to act against the existing order. And acting against the existing order is the first step on a very long staircase that ends in places that the person who took the first step did not intend to go. It tells us that the Imperium treats human lives as a calculable expenditure, and that this treatment is not a corruption of the Imperium's ideals, but 14 million soldiers were sent to Vraks and killed there, because the Departamento Munitorum calculated that 14 million soldiers was the correct number. The calculation was conducted before the campaign began, with the specific precision of an institution that has been conducting calculations of this kind for 10,000 years, and has therefore achieved a level of competence at them that is simultaneously impressive and horrifying. The question of whether 14 million human lives was a proportionate price for reclaiming an armoury world was not asked in the calculation. It was not asked because it is not a question that the calculation's framework provides for. The Imperium does not ask that question. It asks how many men it requires to accomplish the objective, and then it provides that many men. And if they are all Death Korps, and the Death Korps has already decided that its soldiers are available for exactly this kind of expenditure, then the transaction is conducted on those terms, without the kind of moral friction that a different kind of society might introduce. It tells us that the Death Korps of Krieg is one of the most terrible things the Imperium has ever made. Not in the sense of being monstrous, but in the sense of being the most complete possible expression of what the Imperium's logic produces when it is applied to human beings with full consistency. A culture built on guilt, an identity built on expendability, a theology of atonement conducted through self-annihilation, sustained across 500 years of underground civil war on a radioactive wasteland, and refined into an instrument of industrial self-sacrifice that the Departamento Munitorum deploys, with the confidence of a tool whose properties are fully understood. The Death Korps soldiers who died on Vraks died for the Emperor and for the Imperium, and for the specific calculation that said their deaths were necessary and sufficient to achieve the objective. They died for a cause that is genuinely real and genuinely worth dying for, if you believe in the Emperor's necessity, which the Death Korps does more absolutely and more completely than perhaps any other formation in the Astra Militarum. And they died in numbers and in conditions and in ways that the accounting of the campaign records with the even measured tone of a ledger. And it tells us that chaos, when it enters the galaxy through a door that a man of faith has opened without understanding what he was opening it to, does not arrive wearing the face that would allow its nature to be recognized in time to close the door again. It arrives wearing the face of the legitimate grievance. It arrives in the voice of the preacher who is genuinely right about the injustice he has identified. It arrives in the love that 8 million people felt for a cardinal who walked barefoot into hungry villages and meant every word of every sermon he preached. It arrives through faith and love, and the desire for justice. And it uses those things up, and what it leaves when it is done with them is a world under Ordo Malleus interdiction. A basilica that was once a site of miracles converted into a slaughterhouse. And in the deepest level of the dungeons, something that was once a cardinal of the Scarus sector, reduced to a biological remnant of what the Chaos Gods do to those they consume. Still technically alive, 17 years. 14 million men. One world. Quarantined and dead. And the Administratum, on its worlds and in its vaulted offices, is already running its calculations for the next campaign that will require the same kind of expenditure, with the same even tone, and the same precise arithmetic, and the same complete absence of the question that the Siege of Vraks most clearly demonstrates should be asked first. The Departamento Munitorum does not ask whether the cost is proportionate. It asks whether the cost can be afforded. On Vraks, the answer was yes. The tally is in the ledgers. The Death Korps are already on their next assignment. The Van Meersland wastes are silent now, except for the electrical storms that walk across the dead volcanic plain in the red murk of Vrax's dim and dying sun. And the silence is the loudest thing there. The silence of 14 million men who went over the parapet in the grey dawn and advanced across the open ground and did not come back. The silence of the Emperor's accounting of a campaign that the Emperor's servants conducted in his name, on his behalf, with the specific patient devotion that 17 years of the worst war in the Scarus sector's recent history produced in men who did not know how to be anything other than what they were. In life, war. In death, peace. In life, shame. In death, atonement. The tally is closed. The accounting is complete. And somewhere in the void, in the dark regions beyond the Scarus sector's edge, Jufa the Impaler is still out there, still carrying a Commissar General's body on his armor, still fighting in the name of a god who will never be satisfied and never be finished, waiting for the next war to begin. There is always a next war. The Imperium and all those who fight against it and all those who fight for it have learned this about the galaxy they inhabit. There is always a next war. The Siege of Vraks is over. The record stands. The dead are counted. Rest now. There is a moment in the campaign records, buried in the operational logs of the 826 Bont M41 operations, that deserves more attention than the summary accounts of the siege tend to give it. The Red Scorpions chapter had been assigned to Vraks in support of the 88th Siege Army, their arrival part of Marshal Kargori's broader effort to introduce specific capabilities to the campaign that the Death Korps alone could not provide. The Red Scorpions brought what Space Marines bring to any engagement where they are properly deployed, which is the specific combination of individual capability and psychological impact that the presence of Astartes on a battlefield creates in both the force they support and the force they oppose. The Death Korps, who do not register psychological impact in either direction with any obvious expression, acknowledged the Red Scorpions' arrival with the same even competence they brought to all things. The renegade defenders, who had been fighting against the Krieg for years and had developed their own calibration of what the Krieg's presence meant and did not mean, encountered Space Marines in their defensive positions and discovered that their calibration needed revision. Operation Execution Place, the designation given to the Red Scorpions' specific breakthrough action in Sector 5744, was planned with the specificity that Space Marine operations tend to receive when the specific objective is a defended breach in a fortified ring. The sector had been identified as a potential penetration point through the careful analysis of months of forward observation and engineering reconnaissance. A point where the combination of artillery preparation and engineering work had degraded the defensive integrity to the level at which an assault could achieve a breach, rather than simply sustaining casualties against an intact line. The Red Scorpions Terminators teleported in through a homer placed by a forward scouting element, materializing in the breach itself rather than approaching it across the contested ground, and established a foothold in the time before the Renegade Reserve could be brought to bear on the position. The counterattack came. It came with the weight that the Chaos-reinforced Renegade force could bring to bear on a position of this specific value, which was considerable. Chaos Ogrins, those surgically modified and combat-drugged versions of the abhuman strain that the Renegades had prepared from Vraks' own abhuman labor population, were committed against the breach, and the accounts of what a single Chaos Ogrin was capable of against standard Krieg infantry before sufficient weight of fire brought it down are consistent enough across multiple witnesses to be taken as accurate. And the accurate version of those accounts is not comfortable reading. A Legio Volcanum Titan was directed toward the breach as well. The traitor engine's plasma blast and Titan scale weapons applied to the space that the Red Scorpions were holding on the grounds that nothing short of Titan scale weapons was going to dislodge them. The Red Scorpions held. They held with the specific quality of Space Marine stubbornness that is the product of training and gene seed, and the centuries of experience that the chapter's warriors had accumulated before they arrived at Vraks. And they held against everything that the renegade force could bring to bear on them, until the Krieg assault elements from the adjacent sectors could be redirected to exploit the breach and widen it into something that could be held without the Red Scorpions being the specific point of resistance. Veteran Sergeant Karab Cullen, who would later lead the chapter as its chapter master, was among the Terminators who held the breach. His account of the engagement, preserved in the chapter's own records, describes the specific quality of the fighting with the directness of a warrior who has decided that the most accurate description is the best one. They held because there was nowhere to fall back to and nothing useful to be achieved by stopping, and the chaos forces that came against them were not infinite, and eventually a position that is held long enough becomes a position that can be held. The Legio Astorum fought its Titan engagements across the Van Meersland wastes with the weight of machines whose scale makes the ordinary categories of military engagement inadequate to describe. A Titan is not simply a very large weapon system. It is a war machine of a scale that changes the physical environment it operates in, whose footsteps leave craters and whose weapons fire reshapes terrain, and whose presence in a battle creates a specific quality of priority that everything else on the battlefield must organize itself around. When Legio Astorum and Legio Vulcanum walked toward each other across the pumice flats of Vraks, the Death Korps and renegade infantry in the areas between and around them had to make specific tactical decisions about their relationship to things that could step on them without noticing. The Legio Vulcanum's Titans were not simply damaged machines whose pilots had pledged to chaos and continued as before. They were machines in which something of the warp had been permitted to take up residence. Engines whose machine spirits had been replaced or supplemented by entities that took pleasure in the specific form of destruction that a Titan can inflict, and that directed the machines accordingly. The Princeps and Moderati who served aboard them were in relationships with their machine spirits that the Adeptus Mechanicus found deeply disturbing to contemplate. Not because such relationships were unknown, but because the specific form they took in the Legio Vulcanum's case was the form in which the machine's increasingly malevolent intelligence was directing the crew, rather than the reverse. The machines wanted things. The warp entities that had come to inhabit them wanted things. What they wanted was more violence, more destruction, more of the specific experience that operating at Titan scale in a combat environment provides, and the crews who were theoretically in control were providing it because the alternative, which was to stop providing it, was not an option that an entity sharing your consciousness was going to cooperate with. The Death Korps engineers who mined beneath the Legio Vulcanum's patrol routes brought down 2 of them through tunnel charge detonations that the mine's scale required extraordinary preparation, months of digging, and the placement of quantities of explosive that would have flattened a normal building repeatedly. The detonations worked. The Titans fell. The machines died in ways that the Ordo Malleus noted in their files, with the notation that the entities inhabiting the machines at the time of their deaths had been displaced into the warp rather than destroyed, and that the precise disposition of those entities after their displacement was not known. which is a notation that the Ordo files in the category of unresolved concerns and monitors with the patience of an institution that understands that unresolved concerns of this kind tend to resolve eventually, usually in ways that require significant military response. The Death Guard sectors of the battle require their own attention, because they represent the most specific and the most grueling version of what chaos warfare can produce. When one of the four great powers of the ruinous path decides to commit fully to a specific battlefield, the Apostles of Contagion's deployment of TP3 against the 19th Siege Regiment was not simply a tactical decision taken for immediate military effect. It was a ritual conducted with the theological precision that Necrosius the Undying brought to all his operations, aimed at producing the specific quality of suffering and death that Nurgle's philosophy requires, and that the Grandfather accepts as devotion. The 19th Siege Regiment was consumed as an offering. The gas came first. The acidic chemical compound that penetrated the Krieg rebreathers through the specific vulnerability in the filter specifications that Necrosius's researchers had identified and exploited, burning through the filters and into the lungs of men whose whole culture was built around the endurance of chemical environments, and who had therefore never imagined that the protection that made that endurance possible could be engineered to fail. Then the zombie plague. The specifics of Nurgle's zombie plague in the context of a trench system are not pleasant to think about, and were not pleasant to experience for the adjacent Krieg regiments who had to address the outbreak before it spread beyond the 19th sector. The dead do not stay dead when Nurgle has taken an interest in them. Not because Nurgle resurrects them in any meaningful sense of the word. Not because anything of the person who died returns in the animated body, but because Nurgle's decay is a process that does not distinguish between alive and dead in the way that most biological processes do, and the specific organisms that Nurgle's servants cultivate and distribute can sustain the basic motor functions of a recently dead body for long enough to make it a continuing hazard to the living things around it. The 19th Regiment's positions became a zone that the Krieg engineers eventually designated for sealing rather than clearing, cutting the affected trench sections off from the rest of the network with barriers and fire. Because the specific kind of clearing operation that would have been required was not cost-effective in the 88th Siege Army's calculation. The chemical warfare elements of the Death Guard's contribution to the Vraks campaign extended beyond the 19th Regiment's destruction. The Tainted, the Lords of Decay, the Purge, and the Apostles of Contagion each brought their specific catalogue of Nurgle blessed diseases and toxins to bear on the Krieg lines throughout the later years of the campaign, and the Corps's chemical protection, however thorough it was by the standards of non-Krieg military forces, was inadequate to address weapons developed by beings who had spent thousands of years perfecting the specific violation of biological systems. The Krieg took losses to disease and chemical exposure that the pre-war projections had not accounted for, and those losses fed into the tally that the quartermaster cadre maintained, and that the Departamento Munitorum reviewed, and that the calculations incorporated as additional expenditure against the same objective. Arcos and the Alpha Legion's specific contribution to the later stages of the war, after the Chaos counter-offensive had been contained and Kargori's recovery had pushed the front back toward the citadel, was characteristically indirect. The Alpha Legion's value in a sustained siege was not in the direct combat their warriors could provide, which was exceptional but which represented a small number of highly capable combatants rather than the mass force that the war's attrition dynamics actually required. Their value was in intelligence and subversion, in the specific capabilities that the Alpha Legion had refined over 10 millennia of operating in the spaces between the observable and the acknowledged. They maintained awareness of the Imperial assault's developing plans through channels that the 88th Siege Army's counterintelligence operations never fully closed, feeding that awareness to the Warband Coalition's defenders in ways that allowed specific Imperial thrust lines to be anticipated and specifically defended. When Azrael's Dark Angels struck the starport in 821 M41, Arcos was present, and the record of the engagement at the starport includes the specific detail that became one of the campaign's most noted individual moments. The Dark Angel's banner-bearer fell to Arcos directly, the Chaos Lord killing a Space Marine champion in a personal exchange that Azrael himself intervened to end. The two figures, the Supreme Grand Master of the First Legion and the Faithless Lord of the Alpha Legion, fought in the starport's loading docks while the battle raged around them, and neither killed the other. And Arcos withdrew when the calculus of the engagement had produced what he needed from it, which was not the Dark Angel's defeat but the specific intelligence about their capabilities and priorities that the engagement had revealed. He was captured at the siege's end. The Angels of Absolution, the Dark Angel's successor chapter, found him when the citadel fell and the perimeter was closed, and the options that had previously allowed the Alpha Legion to avoid commitment to a specific location were no longer available to him. He was taken to the Rock with 14 of his warriors, and what has been learned from him in the years since is information that the Dark Angels and the Inquisition share only with each other, in the specific way that institutions with separate interests and a common need sometimes share things, which is incompletely, and with each side calculating what the other side does not need to know. The Red Scorpion's second major operation at Vraks, the final phase assault in 830 Fort 1, under Lord High Commander Varant Ortiz, was the engagement in which the chapter distinguished itself most completely in the campaign's record. They were deployed for the assault on the final gate complexes, the three great gates that controlled access to the citadel's inner sanctum, and the fighting at each gate was the specific kind of fighting that the campaign's final stages had been building toward, close and vicious and conducted in enclosed spaces, where the advantage that Space Marines hold in open battle was reduced but not eliminated, and where the cost of each meter was extracted with precise regularity. The 261st Siege Regiment was destroyed in the assault on the Cardinal's Gate. The regiment's tally closed at the specific moment when its last effective fighting formation ceased to exist as a formation and became instead a collection of individuals who continued to advance, because the Death Korps advances, and because the gate was ahead of them and not yet taken. The Red Scorpions came through behind what was left of the 261st and finished the work. The war beneath Vraks, which Kargori had launched as a supplementary axis of advance, produced in its final years a specific form of combat that had no direct parallel in the surface war above it, and that the campaign records, describe with the slightly puzzled tone that military documentation sometimes takes when it is trying to use the vocabulary of conventional warfare. to describe something that the vocabulary was not designed to accommodate. The underground war on Vraks was fought in a three-dimensional maze of tunnels and chambers that had been expanded from Vraks's natural geological cave system by both the Defense Corps engineering teams and the renegade sappers working to counter and intercept them. It had its own geography, its own tactical vocabulary, its own specific forms of ambush and counter-ambush, and the particular terror of being in an enclosed space underground when the lights fail, which they sometimes did when the explosive charges that both sides were placing in each other's tunnel systems detonated and severed the power and communications lines that the tunnel fighters depended on. The Chaos forces that had been driven underground during the later phases of the surface assault found the tunnel system a more congenial operating environment than the Death Korps, for reasons that had to do with the specific natures that Chaos had given them. The Apostles of Contagion's warriors, those Death Guard champions whose augmented bodies had made them largely indifferent to the tunnel environment's physical hazards, moved through the underground spaces with a competence that the Krieg engineering teams found unexpectedly difficult to match. The specific horror of encountering a Death Guard champion in a tunnel barely wide enough for two men to pass was a horror that several survivors of the underground campaign described in their testimony with consistent emphasis on the physical impossibility of any tactical response other than the one that the Krieg doctrine specified, which was to engage the enemy with every available weapon, accept the casualties that resulted, and continue advancing. They continued advancing. This is the phrase that the records return to again and again, through every phase and every catastrophe and every adaptation of the enemy and every miscalculation of the command and every specific form of horror that the Chaos Coalition's presence on Vraks produced. The Death Korps continued advancing. Not because they did not suffer, not because the losses did not register in their tally. Not because the specific forms of death that the Death Guard and the World Eaters and the Sanctified's demonic experiments were producing were not genuinely terrible in ways that tested even the Krieg's deep they continued because continuing was their function and their theology and their specific answer to the question of what a soldier does when the objective is ahead and the obstacles between the soldier and the objective are not yet overcome. The tally grew to 14 million. It continued growing, increment by increment, entry by entry, in the quartermaster cadre's meticulous ledgers, until the siege ended and the final count could be made, and the total could be confirmed and submitted to the Departmenta Munitorum for incorporation into the campaign record. 14 million entries, each one a numbered designation, each one a human being who had been born on Krieg or in the accelerated birth programs that Krieg had developed to sustain its supply of soldiers, who had been trained from childhood for exactly this expenditure, who had arrived at Vraks with the specific expectation of contributing to a tally rather than surviving to go home, and who had done precisely what they were designed to do. The Death Korps does not produce memorials. Other armies build monuments to their fallen, preserve the names of the dead in the public record, observe anniversaries of significant engagements with the rituals of remembrance that living communities use to maintain their connection to the dead ones. The Death Korps does not do this, not because the deaths are not significant, but because the corps's theology does not require remembrance for the atonement to be valid. The atonement is in the dying. The remembrance is in the continuing. Every Krieg soldier who advances toward the next objective remembers every Krieg soldier who died advancing toward the previous one in the only way that the corps's culture considers appropriate, which is by continuing to advance. The Vraks campaign was, in the regimental histories that the surviving regiments of the 88th Siege Army eventually compiled, one campaign among many. Not the worst. Not the most costly per capita. Because there are campaigns in the Death Korps's record that extracted a higher proportional toll from the formations that conducted them, and that produced more specific and more sustained suffering in the individual soldiers who participated in them. Not the longest, because the Death Korpses fought in campaigns that measured their duration in centuries rather than years. But among the most significant, because the scale of the commitment and the specific nature of what was fought for and what was gained and what was lost had consequences that extended well beyond the Vraks system and that took years to assess fully. The armoury was gone. The 12-year projection had produced a 17-year war. The world was quarantined. The Death Korps had spent 14 million soldiers. And the Administratum has run the numbers, as it always runs the numbers, and has determined that these outcomes were within the acceptable range of the campaign's projected costs, because the Chaos Coalition was expelled and the Daemon world was prevented and the Skara sector's stability was maintained in the specific way that the quarantine and the interdiction and the orbital denial maintained it. The ledger balances, if you use the Administratum's framing for what balancing means, and the Death Korps, which does not have opinions about the Administratum's framings, is already on its next assignment, already digging its next trench line, already advancing toward its next objective, because the advance never stops, and the objective is always ahead and the tally is always open. That is the Siege of Vraks. 17 years. 14 million. One world quarantined and silent. The guns of the Van Meersland wastes are silent now. The trench lines that the 88th Siege Army built across the pumice flats, those hundreds of kilometers of earthworks and bunkers and firing positions and the accumulated geology of years of artillery exchange, are still there. Mostly, the atmosphere's chemical properties will preserve them longer than might otherwise be expected. They are the most permanent thing that the siege left on Vraks. More permanent than the citadel that was the objective of the whole enterprise. More permanent than the shrine of St. Leonis the Blind that was the spiritual center of everything that started this. More permanent than the memory of any of the 14 million men who dug them and died near them, and whose bones are distributed through the soil of the Van Meersland wastes in quantities that the post-war survey teams declined to estimate. The trench lines remain. Empty now, and quiet, and running for 250 kilometers through the volcanic dust of a world declared perdita, and sealed against the galaxy that produced it, in the red murk of the sky that Vraks has always had, and that the war did not change even when it changed everything else. That is what the Siege of Vraks left behind. The record in the Departamento Munitorum's archives, the tally in the ledger, the trench lines in the dust, and the question that the campaign most clearly demands, the question that the Administratum has not asked and will not ask because the Administratum does not conduct that category of inquiry, about whether the proportionality of the expenditure was ever examined by anyone in a position to examine it, and whether the answer would have changed anything if it had been, it probably would not have changed anything. That, perhaps, is the most Vraks thing of all. Consider what it meant, specifically and practically, to be a Death Korps of Krieg soldier in the trenches of the Van Meersland wastes in the 7th year of the siege, which was the year that the Administratum had projected would be approximately the midpoint of a 12-year campaign. The year in which the rate of advance and the rate of attrition and the calculation of remaining defensive capability was supposed to be producing the kind of indicators that a campaign approaching its final third typically produces. Consider what it meant to be in that trench in that year, when the indicators were not producing those projections, and when the front line was not where the calculations said it should be, and when the cost in the ledger was running ahead of the schedule, and the objective was still ahead. Unmistakably still ahead. The towers of the citadel visible in the Vraksian murk on clear days from the forward observation posts that the Death Korps had built into the parapet. Close enough to see and still years away from being reachable at the cost the math required. A Krieg soldier in that trench would have been wearing his sealed greatcoat and his gas mask, because the Krieg always wear the gas mask even when the atmospheric readings suggest the levels are within the range that unaugmented human beings can tolerate. Because the readings sometimes change without warning, and the Death Korps does not find the slight inconvenience of wearing the mask in acceptable conditions to be worth the risk of not having it in conditions that are not. He would have had his lasgun, the Lucius pattern rifle that the Death Korps prefers for its slightly higher individual charge capacity, and its bayonet mount, because the Death Korps uses its bayonet frequently enough that the mount is not a formality. He would have had the number that identified him in the regimental tally, tattooed on the inside of his wrist, where it can be checked even if the rest of the identification tags have been lost. He would be waiting, or working. The Death Korps is very rarely simply waiting in the pure contemplative sense that the word implies, because the specific culture of the corps and the specific demands of the siege environment combine to produce soldiers who are either engaged in the current task or preparing for the next one. There is always a current task and there is always a next one. Because maintaining 250 kilometers of trench system in the condition that the Death Korps' standards require is a continuous occupation in itself, independent of the actual fighting. The walls need reveating, the drainage sumps need clearing, the communication trenches need maintaining, the forward observation posts need their rotation of sentries in the specific pattern that the sector's tactical situation requires. The artillery liaison officers need their calculations updated. The quartermaster teams need their accounting verified. The engineering companies need their current tunneling assignments progressed to their current benchmarks. He would not be afraid. Not in the way that the word afraid describes the experience of most soldiers in most combat environments. Not because the Death Korps is incapable of fear, which is a misconception that people who have not served alongside them sometimes develop from the surface appearance of their conduct, but because the specific relationship to their own mortality that Krieg culture produces in its soldiers means that fear, in the sense of the subjective experience of being threatened and wishing to avoid the threat, is not the primary organizing emotion of the Death Korps soldiers' inner life. The primary organizing emotion is something closer to duty, though duty is also inadequate. too mild and too administrative sounding to capture what is actually happening in the psychology of a being who has decided that the question of whether they personally survive this engagement has already been answered, and that the answer does not change the requirement to advance. He would be eating sometimes. The Death Korps receives its rations through the same supply lines that the Imperial Guard system maintains for all its formations. Protein slabs and nutrient concentrations, and the specific calories that the Departmenta Munitorum has calculated, are sufficient to sustain a soldier's combat effectiveness, without providing the kind of surplus that the administratum considers an unnecessary expenditure. He would eat because the body requires fuel, and the Death Korps's relationship to its own bodies is instrumental rather than indulgent. The body a tool to be maintained in working condition rather than a self to be nurtured. He would eat without apparent pleasure, and without apparent displeasure, with the specific neutrality of approach that the Krieg bring to all the biological necessities. He would sing, perhaps, the litany, or the portions of it that the regimental tradition he belongs to has preserved. In life, war; in death, peace; in life, shame; in death, atonement. He would sing it in the Krieg manner, which is not the manner of singing that celebrates or mourns or expresses individual feeling, but the manner of a liturgical practice that has been preserved, because the preservation of it is itself meaningful. Because to be the kind of person who knows the litany and sings it is to be connected to the 500 years of underground war, and the 14 generations of Death Korps soldiers who sang it before him, which is to say to be connected to the specific tradition of atonement that gives his own existence its meaning. There is a story, preserved in multiple versions in the oral tradition of the Death Korps regiments that served at Vraks, of a grenadier named Traitor who was assigned to a forward position in the 4th year of the siege, and who occupied it for 16 months before rotation to the rear lines, which was a period significantly longer than the standard rotation schedule specified. The standard schedule had been disrupted by the specific demands of the tactical situation in his sector, where the renegade position opposite his was applying pressure that the regiment's command had determined required continuous occupation of the forward position rather than the planned rotational pattern. Traitor occupied the position. He performed his duties as specified. He survived. When he was eventually rotated to the rear for the rest period that the standard schedule prescribed, he submitted a formal request, through the proper channels, to be returned to the forward position when the rest period concluded. The request was granted. He went back. The request is preserved in the regimental archive, not because the request was unusual by Death Korps standards, but because the commanding officer who approved it added a marginal notation that the archivists, working years later to compile the regimental history, found instructive. The notation said simply, "He asks because the forward position is where the work is." This is what the Death Korps means by purpose. Not glory, not honor in the abstract, not the specific pride of accomplishment that other soldiers carry back from their best moments. The work. The forward position is where the work is. Everything else is preparation for the work, or recovery from it, or documentation of it. The Death Korps soldier who asks to return to the forward position is not asking for the most dangerous assignment. He is asking to be where the thing he was built to do is being done. It is the most human possible request, in the specific and terrible way that the Death Korps' theology has made human. The Vraksian renegades, those 8 million people who had followed Cardinal Zaffan's call and who had been fighting for 17 years by the time the citadel fell, deserve their own consideration, because the accounts of the siege tend to describe them primarily as either the defenders of the position or the victims of the Chaos Coalition's domination of the world they had risen to liberate. And neither description fully captures what it means to have been one of those people across those 17 years. They had believed, most of them, at the beginning. The belief was genuine. The Cardinal had preached to them for years, had walked among them in the specific way of a man who genuinely cared about the people he was preaching to, and the message he had delivered was a message about justice and liberation, and the Emperor's true will as opposed to the Administratum's corrupt interpretation of it. And the message had found purchase in people whose lives had given them specific reasons to want to believe that something about their situation was going to change. By the 7th year, most of them had stopped believing in the specific thing they had started believing in, because the specific thing had not delivered the liberation it had promised, and the world they were living in was worse by most measurable dimensions than the world they had risen against. The Chaos Space Marines, who were ostensibly fighting in support of their cause, had been running the defense for years on terms that the original cause had nothing to say about. The food supplies that the armoury had contained and that had been distributed to the population in the early years of the revolt were depleted. The civilian population was eating what the Chaos Warlord's supply management provided, which was enough to sustain combat effectiveness and not much beyond it. The specific freedoms that the Cardinal's preaching had promised were not present in a world under Zhufor's governance, because Zhufor's governance was not the kind of governance that maintained specific freedoms. It was the kind that maintained the specific conditions that Khorne's requirements specified, which had almost no overlap with anything that the Vraksian population had thought it was fighting for. They continued fighting anyway. This is the specific tragedy of the Vraksian renegade, forces that the accounts of the siege have difficulty accommodating, because the accounts are written from the perspective of the Imperium, which requires a villain and has designated the renegades as the villain, without consistently engaging with the question of how many of those 8 million people had enough information about what they had signed on to in order to have made a genuinely informed choice. They continued fighting because the alternative, which was surrender to the Death Korps, was not an option that their experience of the Death Korps' methods recommended to them. The Krieg did not take prisoners in any volume that would have made surrender a viable strategy for a population of millions. They continued fighting because the Chaos Warlords did not permit anything else. They continued fighting because the community of people around them was fighting, and the social bonds that hold communities together in conditions of shared danger are very strong, stronger than most ideological reservations, stronger than most second thoughts about the original decision. They continued fighting because they were there, and the Krieg were there, and the war was happening whether they continued fighting or not. Many of them died in ways that had nothing to do with combat, and everything to do with the specific ways that the Chaos Gods treat the populations they have inherited. Nurgle's plagues moved through the civilian sectors of the Citadel's interior with the indiscriminate thoroughness that Nurgle's servants tend to apply to things, making no meaningful distinction between the renegade soldiers and the labor corps workers who had been swept into the revolt by the momentum of events. The World Eaters regarded the Vraksian militia fighters with the specific combination of contempt and hunger that cornate warriors tend to bring to their interactions with non-cornate forces, tolerating their presence when they were useful and eliminating them when they were not, with a casualness that was not malice but was worse than malice in its way, because malice at least implies a relationship. Cornate indifference to the lives of the human fighters nominally on their side was simply the expression of a theology that found no particular value in lives that were not actively generating violence at any given moment. What remained of the Vraxian renegade population when the citadel fell was not, in the Ordo Malleus's assessment, a population that could be returned to the Emperor's service. The specific quantity and duration of chaos corruption, the 17 years of progressive exposure to the warbands and their theologies, and the specific biological and psychic changes that prolonged proximity to the ruinous powers produces in ordinary human beings, had produced changes that the Inquisition classified as irreversible at population scale. Individual exceptions might theoretically have existed. The systematic identification and preservation of those exceptions was not operationally feasible in the context of a post-siege purification campaign. The Ordo Malleus made the decision that the records describe with the specific clinical language of institutions that have made this decision many times, and have developed a vocabulary for making it that does not require them to engage with its individual human components. The population was exterminated. This is one of the costs of the Siege of Vraks that does not appear in the Departamento Munitorum's 14 million. It appears in the Ordo Malleus's own records, classified separately, in the same neutral notation that the Inquisition uses for operations of this kind, and it is not included in the headline figure of the campaign's cost, because the headline figure refers to Imperial Guard losses, and the Vraxian population were not technically Imperial Guard. They were renegades. The distinction is meaningful in the Imperial legal framework, and entirely without meaning at the level of the individual human beings to whom it was applied. The Death Korps of Krieg was already on its next assignment when the Ordo Malleus was completing its post-siege operations on Vraks. This is not metaphor. The regiments that had survived the 17 years of the campaign in the diminished but functional state that 17 years of continuous reinforcement and continuous attrition produces were assigned to their next deployment before the final operational reports from Vraks had been filed. The Departamento Munitorum had calculated the optimal use of the remaining formation's capability and had made the assignment accordingly, because the Departamento Munitorum does not pause, it processes. And the Death Korps, whose entire existence is a form of forward motion, does not pause either. The next front is always ahead. The next trench is always being dug. The next assault is always being planned by officers who will not advance to see whether the advance succeeds, and whose careers are measured in the correct execution of the advance, rather than in its survival. The Departamento Munitorum's post-campaign review, conducted at Thracian Primaris in the months after the citadel fell, took note of several areas where the campaign's conduct had deviated from the original projections, and offered recommendations for improving the accuracy of future projections of similar campaigns. The recommendations were thorough and in several cases astute. The review noted that the failure to account for chaos space reinforcement had been the primary driver of the campaign's extension beyond the projected 12 years, and recommended that future campaigns against worlds with known or suspected connections to the Eye of Terror incorporate contingency planning for this variable. It noted that the initial command structure's reliance on remote direction had contributed to tactical inflexibility in the campaign's first phase, and recommended closer attention to on-site command presence in future operations of this scale. It offered a revised formula for projecting campaign durations that incorporated the observed data from Vraks into its calculations. It did not recommend examining whether the campaign had been worth what it cost. That is not a category of recommendation that the Departmenta Munitorum produces, because the Departmenta Munitorum does not evaluate the worth of campaigns in the sense of comparing the cost to the benefit in a framework that assigns the kind of value to human lives that such a comparison would require. The Departmento evaluates the execution of campaigns. It does not evaluate their justification. The justification is determined by other bodies, acting on other principles, operating with other frameworks, and the Departmento Munitorum receives its assignments from those bodies and executes them to the standard that the bodies require. Whether the assignment was correct is not the Departmento Munitorum's department, which is not a pun, but a precise description of how the machinery of the Imperium distributes the question of moral accountability across so many separate institutions that no single one of them can be identified as the one that bears it. The Siege of Vraks is over. 17 years after the first shells fell on the Van Meersland wastes, after the first Death Korps soldier went over the parapet in the grey dawn and advanced toward a defensive line that the calculations said was necessary to cross, after the first entry was made in the tally that would eventually reach 14 million, after the cardinal of the Scarus sector was found in a dungeon as something that had once been a man, after the bloodthirster Angrath was banished by Hector Rex with the force-sword Arius, after the rift was sealed by Arven Stern and the Grey Knights and Vraks Prime was declared perdita, and the void around it was declared interdicted, and the galaxy was invited to treat the world as if it did not exist. The siege is over. The trench lines remain in the dust. The tally is closed at 14 million. The citadel stands, partially its inner structures collapsed or burned or damaged beyond any realistic assessment of repair. The Basilica of St. Leonis the Blind reduced to rubble on the volcanic plateau that was once the highest point of an armoury world and is now the highest point of nothing. The world has no population. The weapons it was built to store are gone. The strategic resource that the campaign recovered is a quarantined wasteland that cannot be approached without inquisitorial sanction. The Imperium continues. The Death Korps continues. The Departmenta Munitorum continues to calculate the cost of the next campaign, and the next, and the one after that. Each calculation running the same formula, each formula arriving at the same kind of answer. Each answer expressed in the same kind of numbers. Each number a human being in a Krieg rebreather mask advancing toward an objective in the grey dawn. In life, war; in death, peace; in life, shame; in death, atonement. The siege is over. The tally is closed. The account is settled. Rest now. The Scarus sector recovered. This is the kind of statement that the imperial histories of periods like the Vraks campaign need to include, because recovery is the context that gives the devastation its shape. Without the recovery, the devastation is simply loss, an accounting of what was spent and destroyed with no frame that places it in relationship to what came after. With the recovery, the devastation becomes the price. And the question of whether the price was worth what was bought becomes at least theoretically askable, even if the asking produces answers that are uncomfortable in the ways that honest answers to these kinds of questions tend to produce. The Scarus sector recovered in the sense that the planetary systems around Vraks continued their normal operations, that the trade routes through the sector were not permanently disrupted, that the worlds that had been supplying regiments to the 88th Siege Army's reinforcement cycle resumed their normal levy schedules when the campaign concluded, that the political structures of the sector's governance, which had been operating in the shadow of a 17-year siege at a significant armoury world, returned to something resembling their peacetime configuration. The Scarus sector did not recover the armoury. That was gone. And the worlds adjacent to the Eye of Terror that the Vraks armoury had been positioned to supply were supplied less well in the decades after the siege than they had been before it. A deficit that the Departamento Munitorum's replacement logistics program addressed partially but not fully, because the armoury world as a concept requires centuries to build the kind of inventory that makes it strategically significant, and the years since the siege have not been sufficient to build an equivalent. The broader question of whether the Chaos Coalition's objectives at Vraks were achieved, even partially, even in the negative sense of having denied the Imperium the armoury's use for the years of the siege and the indefinite future of the interdiction, is a question that the Ordo Malleus's strategic analysts find uncomfortable to answer definitively. The specific objective that Abaddon's patronage of Jufor's deployment was aimed at, which was the weakening of the Eye of Terror's adjacent defenses in preparation for the eventual 13th Black Crusade, was achieved in a manner that the campaign's outcome supports. The armoury that would have supplied the Cadian Gate's defending forces in the opening stages of the Black Crusade was consumed by the siege that prevented it from being used for that purpose. This is the specific accounting that the despoiler's strategy required, and the siege delivered it. The Imperium won the battle. The despoiler won the campaign. These are not contradictory statements, because the battle and the campaign were different things, aimed at different objectives, measured by different criteria. Rex banished Angrath and the world did not become a daemon world, which was the battle's objective, and which Rex achieved. The armoury was denied to the Cadian defence network, which was the campaign's objective from Abaddon's perspective, and which 17 years of fighting achieved. Both things are true simultaneously, and holding both of them simultaneously is the kind of thinking about the Vraks siege that the Departamento Munitorum's review did not attempt. Because the Departamento Munitorum's review was not designed to evaluate the campaign in terms of the enemy's objectives, only in terms of its own. The Departamento Munitorum is a very good institutional tool for certain kinds of problems. It is a very bad institutional tool for the specific kind of problem that is defined by the enemy's understanding of the war's real objectives, rather than the Imperium's understanding of them. Because the Departamento Munitorum's toolset does not have a good function for that kind of problem. It calculates what it can measure, and what it can measure is the Imperium side of the ledger, and the Chaos side of the ledger is maintained by entities whose objectives and accounting methods are not directly accessible to the Departamento Munitorum's analysts, and whose influence on the war's actual shape was therefore not fully incorporated into the calculations that directed the war. This is not a criticism of the Departamento Munitorum. It is a description of the Imperium's structural situation, which is that it operates a vast civilizational machine, with tools that were adequate for the problems of a functioning civilization and that have been progressively less adequate for the problems of a civilization, in the state that 10,000 years of the Long War and the specific entropy of the post-heresy decline have produced. The Departamento Munitorum calculates well within the assumptions its calculation framework provides. What it cannot do is evaluate its own assumptions. That evaluation requires the kind of institutional self-examination that organizations built for operational rather than evaluative purposes do not reliably produce. The Grey Knights have their own assessment of the Vraks campaign, and the assessment differs from the Departamento Munitorum's in ways that reflect the different categories of concern that each institution maintains. The Grey Knights did not go to Vraks to reclaim an armoury. They went to prevent a demonic incursion. And by their measure, the incursion was prevented, and the specific threat that their presence was required to address was addressed, and the campaign was a success. Brother Captain Arturus died banishing Angrath's vanguard, and Brother Captain Stern sealed the final rift, and the warp's permanent intrusion into the Scarra sector was stopped at the specific cost that stopping it required. This is the Grey Knights' accounting of Vraks, and within the specific parameters of what the Grey Knights count as their responsibility, it is a positive balance. The Red Scorpions assess the campaign differently again. Their accounting is the accounting of a chapter that values its warrior heritage and the specific legacy of accomplishment that a chapter's history represents. And the Vraks campaign occupies a significant portion of the more recent section of that legacy. Carib Cullen, who held the breach in Sector 5744, and who later led the chapter, told the story of that engagement in terms that made the specific quality of the Death Korps' presence at Vraks clear in a way that the operational reports did not. He said, in the account preserved in the chapter's archives, that he had fought alongside many forces in his career, and that the Death Korps of Krieg were not the most capable or the most individually distinguished, but that they were the most consistent, that the quality they brought to every engagement was the same quality regardless of the conditions or the cost, that you could look at the Krieg trench lines after a difficult night and find them exactly as they were supposed to be, exactly as the doctrine specified, manned and maintained and ready for the morning's work. He said that this consistency was the most frightening thing about the Death Korps, more frightening in its way than any of the enemy forces he had encountered on Vraks, because the consistency suggested a relationship to purpose that went beyond discipline and training into something else. Something that the Red Scorpions' own deep commitment to their chapter's ideals could recognize without entirely comprehending. He meant, without saying it in this language, that the Death Korps had found a way to remove from their relationship to their own purpose the friction that individual self-preservation instincts normally introduce into the relationship between a warrior and the task the warrior has been given. Most warriors, however well-trained, however deeply committed, introduce some degree of calculation into their engagement with dangerous situations, some weighing of the cost to themselves against the benefit of the action, some internal negotiation between the duty and the survival. The Death Korps had, through 500 years of the specific formative catastrophe of Krieg's history and the theological structure that catastrophe produced, removed that friction. Not the individual warrior's capabilities or intelligence or tactical judgment which remained, but the friction, the calculation, the internal negotiation. It was gone. What remained was the advance, pure and sustained and uninterruptible by anything that the advance encountered except the specific instruction of a superior officer, which the corps obeyed not because it had been conditioned to obey, but because obedience was part of the same structure that had removed the friction. Because a Death Korps soldier who is advancing toward an objective in accordance with his orders has resolved the question of what his life is for in the most complete possible way, and the resolution cannot be undone by the specific obstacles the advance encounters. Cullen said he found this frightening. He did not say he found it admirable, which is the kind of distinction that a warrior of the Red Scorpion's specific character makes carefully. Admirable implies a model, something worth aspiring to. The Death Korps' specific solution to the problem of how a soldier maintains purpose under conditions of extreme cost is not something the Red Scorpions would model themselves on, because the Red Scorpion's specific character includes the kinds of individual relationship to their own lives and to each other's lives that the Death Korps has systematically suppressed. But frightening was accurate. Frightening, and in its own way a kind of testimony to the depth of the wound that Krieg had been trying to heal for 500 years. The Inquisitor Lord Rex has not publicly commented on the Siege of Vraks in any form that the Ordo Malleus's record has made accessible outside its own internal archive. What is known from the internal documents is that his assessment of the campaign's management was critical, specifically on the point of the Departamento Munitorum's failure to consult the Ordo Malleus before committing to a 12-year ground campaign against a world that the Ordo's instruments would have identified, had they been as a significant warp contamination risk from early in the siege's history. The consultation did not happen because the jurisdictional relationship between the Departamento Munitorum and the Ordo Malleus does not require it in campaigns that have not yet been identified as having a daemonic dimension. And the campaign was not identified as having a daemonic dimension until Arcos's arrival made the identification unavoidable, at which point 6 years had already passed. He also noted, in the internal document that was shared with the Conclave of Scarus and the Ordo Malleus's senior hierarchy, that the decision to initially approach Vrax's revolt as a straightforward military reclamation campaign rather than as a potential chaos incursion requiring inquisitorial oversight from the beginning had been made on political grounds, specifically to avoid triggering the protocols that would have brought the Inquisition into the campaign's command structure and the attendant jurisdictional complications that those protocols produced. The Ordo Hereticus had asserted ownership of the case on the grounds that Zaphon was an ecclesiarchy figure, and therefore in their sphere. The Ordo Malleus had the data to suggest that the situation was more complex than the Ordo Hereticus's framing acknowledged. The discussion between the two Ordos about whose jurisdiction applied had consumed time that the campaign could not afford to lose. Rex noted this without naming the specific individuals involved in the discussion, which is the inquisitorial form of making a criticism that everyone in the relevant community will understand and that no one will be able to use as specific grounds for a formal complaint. The Basilica of St. Leonis the Blind. The last time that shrine was visited by a believing pilgrim was in 809 M41, when Cardinal Zaphon's pilgrimage reached Vraks, and the population came out to receive him with the genuine devotion of people who had preserved their faith through the difficult years of the armoury world's existence. 3 years later, the shrine was closed. A year after that, the revolt began, and the shrine was absorbed into the military infrastructure of the citadel's defense. By the time the Chaos Space Marines arrived, it was being used for purposes that had nothing to do with St. Leonis or his miracles. And by the time the Grey Knights reached it, the specific purposes it had been used for in the final years of the siege were documented in the Ordo Malleus's operational reports in sufficient detail to establish the grounds for its designation as irrecoverable. The basilica that Zaphon had loved is rubble now. The Perdita interdiction means no one will go there to commemorate St. Leonis, or to pray, or to seek the miracle that the tradition said had happened on that volcanic plateau above the Van Meersland wastes in an age before the war. Faith is not always enough. This is perhaps the quietest and most difficult truth that the Siege of Vraks produces. The truth that sits beneath the more dramatic truths about chaos and corruption and the cost of industrial warfare and the specific horror of what happens to populations that the ruinous powers consume. Faith is not always enough. It is the Emperor's light requires faith to be perceived and faith to be maintained and faith to sustain the specific quality of human commitment that keeps the billions of the Imperium citizens in their relation to the God Emperor through the grinding difficulty of daily existence in a civilization whose material conditions are often hostile to the maintenance of anything. But faith is not a protection against manipulation. Faith is not a shield against the specific patient exploitation that chaos brings to the vulnerabilities that faith opens in those who hold it. The people of Vraks were faithful. Their cardinal was at the beginning genuinely of the faith. Their desire for justice was real, their love was real, and it all led to chaos. Because faith without wisdom and love, without discernment and desire for justice, without the institutional structures that direct it toward outcomes the Imperium can sustain, are not enough. They are necessary but not sufficient. The ruinous powers have always known this. The Imperium learns it. At Vraks, and at 100 places like Vraks, one expensive lesson at a time. The Death Korps of Krieg is still out there. New regiments raised in the accelerated birth programs on a world whose radioactive surface will not support them directly, but whose underground civilization sustains a population of soldiers at the rate the Departamento Munitorum requires. New numbered designations entered in, new officers trained in the specific doctrine of siege warfare that Vraks demonstrated, and that Krieg had practiced for 500 years before Vraks existed as a military problem. New grenadiers in new gas masks and new greatcoats, bayonets fixed, advancing toward new objectives in the grey dawn of whatever world the Departamento Munitorum has identified as requiring the specific kind of advance that the Death Korps provides. The Krieg do not ask what the objective is worth. They ask what it requires, and they provide it, and they advance, and the tally is maintained, and at some point the calculation closes and the objective is achieved and the campaign is concluded and the tally is submitted to the Departamento Munitorum and the ledger is balanced and the regiments are assigned to the next campaign. This is the Death Korps of Krieg. This is what Vraks cost, and what Vraks was bought with, not in the currency of strategic resources or territorial control, but in the specific currency that the Death Korps and only the Death Korps produces, the currency of human lives offered freely and without calculation in the specific service of a God Emperor who requires them, and an Imperium that depends on them, and will continue to depend on them as long as the galaxy produces the kind of wars that only the Death Korps can fight. The Van Meersland wastes are silent. The trench lines are empty. The tally is closed. 17 years, 14 million, one world dead. The Departamento Munitorum's ledger marks the campaign as concluded. The account is settled. The calculation is complete. Sleep well, if you can. The Krieg do not sleep well, or they sleep the sleep of those who have nothing left to lose and nowhere left to fall. And perhaps there is a kind of peace in that. Perhaps the final line of the litany means something true. In the specific and limited way that things can be true when the costs have all been paid, and what remains is the silence of a world that paid them. In death, peace, rest now.